headlines here. Those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. This is the nest we've made for ourselves. The house we built for ourselves. We invaded Afghanistan. We set this whole situation up. We added tinder to the box, and now it's on fire, and we're effectively running away and leaving this as a massive mess, for the Middle East generally, this, kind of tyrannical religious state on the eastern part of the Middle East that is currently undergoing a sort of downward spiral fall. And also, of course, left a big lingering problem in Afghanistan with the Taliban for Russia and China that they're going to sort of have to sort out. And, I don't see any countries particularly around the world who are fond of the Taliban at all. Not a single country on the face of this earth, as far as I can tell, who's like, yeah, we kind of like those guys. Which means that for any government they form, they're going to find a rather chilly, foreign welcome. And they're going to have, if they want to assert themselves, well, the question remains, how are they going to do that? What form is their government going to take? How are they going to deal with civil unrest? How are they going to deal with all these problems? You see what I'm saying? Bombs. You think the Taliban?
I'm totally joking.
The answer to anything is bombs. Well, you've got the Transformers shirt on. So, I mean, maybe.
By the way, I don't think that's Transformers.
Is that
I think that's some kind of anime.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah. I don't know what the anime is.
A different mech? Yeah, see, I was like, I don't know what that is actually.
It looks like Optimus Prime, but I think it's some kind of anime.
It has horns.
Yeah. It looks like a Transformer with horns.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But it has the gauntlet things on.
It's very hardcore.
For those who can't tell, it is standing,
standing in the red moonlight.
Standing in front of a red moon, like a big red moon. That's the shirt. It's just the outline of this Transformer thing in front of a big red moon.
Epic, right? Epic.
Yeah.
Because it's like, how big is that moon? How big is that? For all we know, that Transformer is like very, very tiny, and they're just blowing it up into this massive proportion. It's like an inch high or something like that, like a little toy. Mm-hmm. Who knows? I choose to believe it's like a Ragnarok, where it grows up to the size of a mountain and that type of thing.
I'd like to think it's just sort of laying on its back on the moon, and it's a 2 scale.
And somebody just, yeah,
exactly.
Who knows?
Anyway, yeah. So my point was, it was partly just because it was the last headline that I read, but also we talking about it, and it's a big problem. The Taliban, the situation in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
What they're leaving. The house that we built for ourselves, the mess we've made, the fact that we're leaving it behind. The U.S. is effectively hightailing it, running away from the problem. Leaving this as a big,
I don't think people are talking about this like talking about in the way that they should. I mean, that's a big deal, right? I mean, we've been there, 20 years? And, the Washington Post, give them credit, the Afghan files were phenomenal in regards to look at the corruption, the incompetence, like the lies that were associated with maintaining our presence in that war, regardless of what happens, regardless of who almost got killed, all that stuff. We're making progress. We're always making progress. 20 years, making progress. Trillions of dollars, thousands of lives lost, hundreds of thousands of Afghanis lives lost, making progress. Mm-hmm. And finally, it's like, all right, we're not making progress. We're going to leave. And not just leave, we're going to hightail it out of here. And not just hightail it out of here, we're going to hightail it out of here at maximum speed, which leaves, meaning you're not leaving in this kind of organized fashion. You're leaving in utter chaos. And regardless of what Biden and what all these other people are talking about, at the end of the day, the Taliban, like I keep saying, in my head, I have this image in my head of the helicopter on the roof, I think it was of the American embassy, with the last Vietnamese person trying to get on the helicopter before that American helicopter takes off. Because everybody and their mama knows that it is going to fall the moment that America leaves, meaning America was propping it up. Same thing, Afghanistan. And in that very specific situation, when the Taliban takes it, the question becomes, what does the Taliban want? And not just what does the Taliban want? Like you said, how does the Taliban engage with its neighbors? How does its neighbors engage with the Taliban? Russia considers the Taliban a terrorist organization. Iran, apparently, are enemies. How does that work? Especially when you're looking at a situation where Taliban seemingly is going to take control of the governmental device. What does that look like? I don't know what that looks like. I do know that the neighbors in that area of the globe are going to have to deal with that. And, it's not that that Iran is like, yes, we want America to stay. It's not that. It's just that reality doesn't necessarily present you with clean wins. And so, while they applaud the U.S. leaving, they're probably all like, Taliban. It's no clean win. And so it's like, and by the same token, people was like, well, hey, Jamarl, based on what you're saying, America should stay forever. That's not what I'm saying at all.
No,
regardless of the consequence, we should leave.
No, if you knew, okay, so if a friend of yours you hadn't seen in a long time came back into your life and was like asking you to consult with them, and it turns out they kind of screwed up as a person.
Yeah.
And like they married somebody they really shouldn't have married, who was like a pathological liar and abusive, and they'd gotten themselves into a bunch of debt. And they were like wondering if they should get out of the relationship. Your response wouldn't be, no, just stay in the relationship. You made some really screwed up decisions.
Yeah.
Just stay in it. Just live with it. Don't learn anything. Just keep on going into this fiery hell pit of a hole that you call your life. Just keep on trucking through it. It's all going to be okay. That wouldn't be the response.
No.
And saying, okay, it's going to hurt to get out of this. You're going to have to put some work in.
Right.
Also does,
Yeah. I mean, look, to be fair,
it just fits. You just got
to invade it.
You made the mistake in the first place. You have to get out of this problem that you created for yourself.
Extricate yourself from a problem that you created.
Yeah. But the sad part about this is we're not going to have to pay for it. We're not going to have to pay for it. We already paid the money. We paid the money to invade. We already paid our costs.
Yes.
We get out of it, and we leave the problem for the millions of people who live there and the other countries who are going to have to deal with them, and the long-term sort of perpetual instability that this situation has created. And, of course, the widespread migrant crisis, refugee crisis, as Afghanistan isn't the main country that people are fleeing right now.
Right.
But, of course, by creating a wider situation of instability in the region, we've set it up. So a lot of people who live in these countries are either having a hard time living there and staying there, or just leaving and creating problems either for us or for all of our neighbors, all of the European friends. Think about how big of the migrant refugee crisis that we created, one of the biggest problems to hit the European Union, arguably the cause of the fascist leaning stuff, all the countries that have drifted rightward that we like to lament, including Hungary and Poland, whether they're on our side or they're on the Russian side or whatever narrative we like to spin up about this. We created that problem. We sent the refugees there in the first place. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, if you think about, so it's very fascinating to me. Europe is an interesting cat because Europe being somewhat of a vassal state of the U.S. I could say that pretty, straightforwardly. They are in this weird box of kowtowing to U.S. policy, by the same token being hurt by U.S. policy, and yet accepting that hurting while complaining on some level. So you would have a situation like Iran, for example, in the JCPOA, and you have Europe, who fully was behind the JCPOA, did not want the U.S. to pull out the JCPOA because what they understood was the Iraq War destabilized Europe extraordinarily. Like, if you think about all the refugees that were fleeing Syria, all the refugees fleeing Iraq, if you think about the destabilization from ISIS, how did that destabilization happen? Where was the vacuum after Saddam? Or where was the vacuum after we smashed those countries to bits? And then you have this kind of weird thing where those people said, rationally, we don't want to be in a war zone where people are chopping heads and raping women. We don't want to be there. We want to leave. And despite the hardship in leaving is better than staying and the havoc that is caused here. That's basically the logic of it. But what does that mean? Well, those people get on a boat, they travel into Europe, they go to Germany, they go to all these other countries. You have Angela Merkel explaining to a child, we just can't let any more of you in. After which, Angela Merkel's pilloried, in which case she lets more in. You have other European countries that tried to show how their values, their ideological values, were just this good of people. We must let these refugees in. And in doing so, great. But just because you have this kind of ideological value thing, you still have to follow through. And you can't have a situation where the refugees and the people who are coming from these countries end up in what basically turn into ghettos. These kind of crime-ridden ghettos because you didn't necessarily give the resources necessary to incorporate or bring these people into society in a way that didn't necessarily end in that. It's chaos. And, in the context of chaos, I would imagine Europe has to know that. Like, I don't think Europe is blissfully unaware that the last war that we engaged in, that all things being equal, like you said, we paid the money in cost. We paid, 4,000 American lives in regards to troops. But if you're really getting down to the brass tacks, who really paid? I mean, Iraqis, 1 million Iraqis died. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of Syrians died. How many Libyans have died? How many Libyans have been sold into slavery?
They paid the cost. That's
an extraordinary cost.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's not even getting into Europe in regards to the destabilization of the politics, in regards to these right-wing figures taking more prominence because people are like, whoa, wow.
Who then uses a boogeyman, and it's a weird Hegelian dialectic.
Exactly.
And I'm not even saying that the migrant crisis we're setting this up in order to spur the rise of right-wing populists, which we can then demonize to rally the troops and circle the wagons with our version of liberal democracy and cosmopolitanism or whatever the case. I'm not saying there's some explicit intent that we set up from the beginning.
I don't think there was an intent at all.
No. Yeah. But I also think what I could see as possible intent, what I could see as possibly intentional, is that we create this migrant crisis, and this creates a looming problem for Europe that is beneficial to American interests. Because what is truly perverse about this setup, about the situation that we have going here, is we have an incentive to keep them weak. We have an incentive.
Europe, yes, of course.
The individual European member countries, we have an incentive to keep them weak so that they are bound together by a union, which we have an incentive to keep tightly wed to our, to our own, to keep tied to our hip effectively.
We do not want them having a military. We do not want them to have it. We don't want any of that stuff.
No, which is why, and this is where Trump, of course, was right about NATO. We subsidize their social welfare policies. We subsidize the Denmarks of the world and the Swedens of the world. We subsidize their social welfare state by subsidizing their military. And I'm not saying that we do it overwhelmingly.
That's not really true, though.
We pay for part of their military, which makes their overall costs go down. If you look at our GDP and what we do, how much more we spend on NATO, which is Trump's argument, or was his argument, of course. There's some validity to that. I'm not even saying that's a good or a bad. I think, of course, it's a bad thing in my opinion. Yeah. But I wasn't stipulating that argument. Yeah. I'm just saying we do subsidize them by paying for their military in order to keep them on a very short leash. And it's neither good for them in the long run, nor in the long run, nor in my opinion, good for the American, your average American person. It's not good for us either.
I don't know if we're subsidizing their health care and stuff like that. I don't buy that argument. They have to pay a certain amount into NATO that Trump was like screaming at them.
It's a very small amount. If they were a sovereign nation with, outside of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, they would have to pay a lot more money. Any sovereign nation would have to pay a lot more money.
I mean,
we're effectively able to, we're paying to keep them on a short leash. And what that does, I'm not even trying to hit the socialist policies. I think in effect it clearly, if they're spending less money in one area, they can spend more on things that are beneficial for their population, which is why if America pulled out, we could arguably do the same. We could stop spending so much on our military and spend more on our public. And hey, maybe if they had higher GDP rates on a year-on-year basis, maybe if we had a new upsurge in productivity around the globe, with a rising tide, you get all boats lifted, so everybody could do better. I'm not even trying to.
I don't know, man. I've heard that argument before that America is subsidizing healthcare around the world.
We make
America subsidizing.
And I've heard all those arguments.
Right wingers like to make those cases.
But I think there's it's not a big enough cudgel for me to like attack socialism with.
Keep in mind though, they have their militaries. You realize the UK has a military. France has a military. You realize these countries do spend money on their military.
Of course, but with the exception of France, and we've talked about this before in the air, any one of the NATO member countries, on the European side, again, a section of France, an exception, I would say, of Turkey, they do not have a sufficient enough military to be able to wage their own war against either each other or any outside country. Their militaries are sort of factionalized. You have certain specialties that different countries have, and I want to get more into this, like who's specialized in what. Yeah. But they're kind of built to function as a one army. Yeah. The EU, the European Union, and the NATO forces in general. Exactly. It's supposed to be one body. It would
be like the United States saying, okay, this state is doing.
Yeah.
It's the United States. They're functioning as one body. It would be weird if we say, like, North Carolina doesn't have an army to take down, South Carolina.
Exactly. Yeah. My individual fingers are not supposed to punch each other. Right. Exactly. They're supposed to form together into a fist. Right.
It's not supposed to do that. Exactly. That's my point. It's not. I don't think it's as simple as the U.S. is subsidizing healthcare or the U.S. is subsidizing the military. On some level, I can kind of agree with that. We're subsidizing military on some level, but I don't think that translates into other policies like healthcare, education, that type of stuff. Those countries were welfare states in general. That's just the way they function. That's the way they thought. Especially with the Soviet Union being that close by, they were in competition. I would even argue the U.S. that change, or the U.S. this kind of FDR-esque.
I think it's hard to tell because this whole thing happened in the post. Why do I always get the name wrong here? The post Monroe Plan era. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wait, no, that's it. I always get it wrong.
Post Monroe.
No, that's the thing. I always get the name wrong. Sherman Plan. I always get it wrong. The relief plan, the World War II relief plan that the Americans engaged in with European partners and allies.
That's not the Sherman Plan. That's the Oh, it'll come to me. It'll come to me. It's not. You're thinking it's not the Monroe Doctrine. That's
exactly.
But it's not the Sherman Plan. It's something else. The name will come to me. It's screwing with me.
Exactly.
You named it something else, and I can't get the name out of my head
I do that
now.
to myself.
It'll come to me. It'll come to me. But I know what you're talking about. The
Marshall Plan.
Marshall Plan. Right?
That's why. That's for some reason they all.
Yeah, the Marshall Plan was phenomenal, and like you say, yeah, on some level it is hard to disassociate one from the other and everything else. But look, like I said, I've heard right wingers make that argument before. If the U.S. firmly believes that, the U.S. has a way of dealing with that and stopping. The U.S. doesn't want to do it.
No,
like you say, it doesn't want to do it.
It keeps the EU on a short leash.
Yeah, perfectly content.
Yeah, dependent on us.
Yeah, but let's do this. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones? With the historical context to tie them together, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. For the People Act. For the People Act. I love that name. For the people, for the public, for the population itself. And what on earth could For the People Act represent with a name like that? Well, voting, of course. And what do we mean by voting? Meaning this capacity for people to go and vote in a way that is not belabored by 5-6 hour lines, that is not in districts that are so gerrymandered that they're these little spindly districts instead of these kind of healthy districts that you would expect in some vibrant democracy. Or, for that matter, that you're not knocking people off the voting rolls, that you're not closing polling locations, that you're not telling people they can use a gun license, but they can't use a student ID. I'm saying, in the greatest democracy ever, voting should not be something that is difficult. It should not be something that should be a challenge. Our elections, A, should be transparent, and B, should be available to each and every American that is eligible and should be eligible to vote, period. It should not be a contest about who can knock people off the voter rolls in order to ensure they have a better chance of getting elected. The issue here is, do you believe in America or not? What I mean by that is there's an argument to be made that, hey, America matters less. The goal, the point, the object of this is to win. Winning matters more. And in the context of winning matters more, everything else is subordinate. Yes, you can have with these ideas of America. Yes, you can have these ideas of freedom and democracy and everything else. But all of that feels a little bit pale and gray if you are on the losing side. And so we appreciate all of these ideas of America, freedom, and democracy. We use those ideas of freedom and democracy when we talk about this stuff. However, our objective is to win. And that's unfortunate that that seems to be where we are in our political space. The point is to win. Whether that's preventing Merrick Garland from getting his seat, whether that's screaming that Donald Trump was carried over the finish line by Vladimir Putin, or whether that's now with Donald Trump screaming that Joe Biden really lost in a landslide, with 30% of Republicans believing that to be true. We're at a weird spot. The majority, I think it's like 90% of the voting regulations that are coming out now are coming from Republicans. And they're doing so in order to restrict voting because, of course, Biden shouldn't be in office. And in Biden being in office, that needs to be remedied. Now, that's not going to be remedied by policy. That's not going to be, hey, we just need to be more popular. We need to put out policies like, hey, maybe we need to increase the minimum wage to $10. Maybe we need to do things to bring jobs back in the United States and have a plan for that. Maybe we need to have a very specific way of bringing down crime in the various communities that the Democrats, at least by our argument, has entirely and completely abandoned. Maybe we should come up with policies to deal with Americans' ills to make America vote for us. No, that's too much like right. That's too much like right. So instead, what we get is change and policy changes in the various states. Now, the catch becomes, what is the Democratic Party going to do about this? It's one thing for the Republican Party to say, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to change these rules. We're going to make it that much more easier for us to get in. Okay, fair enough. Republican plan. What is the Democratic playbook on this? What is the rational playbook on this? The issue here is cause and effect. Everything else is subordinate to that. And in the case of you being in a political space, which is basically an issue of combat, and your opponent has taken a clear and specific pattern of, we are going to stop them from winning in the states. You have the House, you have the Senate, and you have the presidency. What are you going to do about it? The House passes For the People Act. The Senate quibbles about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin and quibbles on this notion of what's right ideologically in this situation. Oh, I don't believe we should get rid of the filibuster because the filibuster is a requirement. Okay, fair enough. Oh, I believe we need to be bipartisan because bipartisanship is the only way for anything to ever get accomplished. Now, the reality of it is the filibuster is there so you don't have to do anything. It's your excuse. It's the thing that holds you back from getting anything accomplished. And the reality of it is the people who are in that party who, for whatever particular reason, doesn't quite understand that their capability of getting elected is up for grabs. It's being held in prize. You're going to be your own ruin. The Kristen Siemenas of the world, the Manchins of the world. Democratic Party has just failed miserably in the Senate to get the For the People Act passed. More interesting, it had no chance of ever passing the Senate because Democrats only had 50 votes total in the Senate, and it could always be filibustered. So the question is, why go through all of this in the first place? Why yell at Manchin and quibble about whether Manchin is going to make a vote that didn't matter? Meaning, it wasn't like Joe Manchin's vote where he's like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to do it. I don't know if I'm going to do it. I don't know if I'm going to do it. And everybody's waiting for Joe Manchin. What is Joe Manchin going to do? What is Joe Manchin going to do? Is Joe Manchin going to vote for it? Is Joe Manchin not going to vote for it? What's Joe Manchin going to do? And Joe Manchin comes in, okay. I've made a choice. I'll vote for it. Complete diva in this. And a vote that didn't matter. It didn't matter. Let's play Schumer. Let's hear Schumer explain this failure and the next steps on this.
You've long said that nothing's off the table when it comes to the filibuster, but now that we've heard clearly from Senator Sinema, Senator Manchin, and others, can you just say that the Senate Democrats will not touch the 60-vote threshold in this Congress?
No, as I said, we are not going to put the cart before the horse. We are going to have this vote, and then we will discuss the future.
So there's some discussion among Democrats perhaps splitting up this big bill going forward, but even so, that is not enough to move forward.
Let's stop right here for a moment. Schumer doesn't have any next steps. You must understand all of this. They knew in advance this bill was going to fail. They knew it. They knew the other bills was going to fail. So why go through it? This is Democratic four-dimensional chess. What they're hoping here is that by putting bills up like this and having them shot down with filibuster after filibuster, that they believe that Kristen Sinema and Manchin may come around to making adjustments to the filibuster. That's their thought. If we could fail enough, maybe they realize that, hey, if we want to succeed, you need to make changes. You need to change your point of view. Whether that works or not it is just wild to watch a political party sit here. I had a disagreement with my boss on whether or not Democrats was going to keep the House and the Senate. I think I'm wrong. I think they're going to lose one. And once they lose one, it's going to be very clear cut that this presidency is over. Shane, what are your thoughts? If these guys can't get their heads together to realize we're under threat across the states. Now, you may not agree with that, but from a political disposition, you should definitely think that way in a political context. And in that sense, how do you defend yourself? And not just how do you defend yourself, how do you make it not just better or, let's say, expand voting, but do so in a way that works in parallel with, hey, not only are we expand voting, we're protecting ourselves in the process of doing this. Do that. But they can't even be brought to doing things that are in their own political interests. And if that's not the death knell, I don't know what is. Because honestly, what do you get past in this situation if you always have to have a 60 vote threshold? And the answer is nothing. The answer is nothing. You couldn't even get Republicans to back you on a split. What is that thing? The Organization for January 6th. And that thing was split in the middle. And you can make a case that says, well, yeah, but the issue here wasn't the fact that the vehicle was split in the middle between Democrats and Republicans. The issue here was that the vehicle existed at all. Meaning the very fact that they exist is a problem for Republicans. Fair enough. By the same token, that thing was split down the middle. That January 6th commission should take place. It was a big deal in regards to the raid on the Capitol. And my point is, if you can't even get something like that with bipartisanship, why on earth do you believe that they're going to give in on any of this other stuff? It is not in Republican interest. Meaning, if you're in the opposition, it doesn't behoove you to work with me. Now, if you're working in the interest of America, yes. But all things being equal, if you are making me look good, you are ensuring that you stay in the opposition. They know that. What brings in bipartisanship is when the person doesn't have a choice, when their position is so untenable that they lump themselves in and by sliding slowly over to your position because they can't necessarily manage the position otherwise. That's not what these guys are talking about. They're talking about bipartisanship for the sake of bipartisanship, or they're talking about the filibuster existing for the sake of the filibuster existing. Well, the filibuster was there, so the filibuster should be there, as if existence in and of itself gives value and credibility to persistence or continued existence. It's very strange. But I would say they're in a political context. And if they're not going to get things accomplished, they're going to lose. I think it's that straightforward. You have a job to do. You were put in to do a job. 600,000 Americans died. And to go back to politics as usual with this nonsense of, oh, we're going to do the sausage making nonsense. I don't think that works in this context. And yeah, going back into, the midterms, you're going to have things to show for you being in office. And if you can't deal with that, I mean, for example, even if you say, okay, we're not going to get rid of the filibuster, you could still say we're going back to the original design of the filibuster where when the filibuster is enacted, everything else stops. You can alter it in a way that makes it better. You could even say, Mr. Smith goes to Washington. That was before your time. But guy stands up.
With it.
You remember it?
Yeah, in the movie.
Yeah, guy stands up, speaks for 40 hours, drops dead out of exhaustion. That, I'm okay with that. But not what we have here. This seems radically untenable to get anything accomplished. And I don't think that they're going to do anything about it, which means nothing of Biden's agenda is going to get done. What are your thoughts?
All right. A couple things here. I'll just three main points. I'll try to go back in reverse and address some of the points you brought up. For one thing, the January 6th commission would inevitably have been biased, not just because it was looking into January 6th, and that's not good for Republicans, but because it would have been biased. It would have been used as an opportunity to ghost hunt, as is happening right now, without the need for any commission. We don't need it. We don't need a congressional commission to hand wring over exactly what happened and who is responsible, blaming everybody from Roger Stone to Alex Jones, like we were talking about just yesterday, for what happened. And if that's how it's being treated in the public eye, just wait until Adam Schiff gets his hands on it or whatever. Just think about the hearings, all of the hearings, because you say now that would be unbiased and it should have happened.
No, I didn't say that. Okay, I said the commission was unbiased. I said the setup of it was unbiased. I said, but the very act of it in and of itself
was a threat to Republicans.
Yeah,
because it was looking into January 6th.
When I argue honestly.
I hear you.
Yeah,
I sometimes I do. Sometimes I play devil's advocate because it makes for better radio.
I don't do that. I never do that.
I sometimes do.
I'm always weird. Like I'm always even weirded out by that because in my head it doesn't function that way. In my head it's like this is what I think.
I'm okay to play different sides of it. Yeah. It's sort of, because it's like you gotta switch around the elephant. Using the blind men and the elephant. You got to look at it from a couple different sides to, I think, fully understand things. That was point one, though. I think it would have been inevitably biased. Anyway, the filibuster, if you were to get rid of the filibuster, simple majority voting is like a power tool. And by their good graces, politicians, it appears, do not currently trust themselves to handle a power tool. So we leave them with simple hammers, nails, and like an auger and like mortar and chisel or whatever we've left them with to work with, the decaying boat of our state, ship of state. My point is, if we gave them a filibuster-free, okay, whoever has the power can take the power, they would very quickly start using that power tool to either accidentally hurt themselves or hurt the other side. That is very clearly what would happen. Look at what each incoming presidency, each incoming administration does with their power. Very quickly, they try to undo everything the previous administration did, which if you had it in person would look like an identity crisis, the worst, like, what are you doing? Why are you slapping yourself? That kind of thing. It wouldn't work. And that's what we would do with it. And that's why, I'm cautious of it, but it's a power tool and we could do a lot more if we knew how to handle it. I would just see Republicans and Democrats hounding each other. Well, anyway.
I don't think about that.
Let's come back to it, but I wanted to make one more point, which is that the Biden administration's messaging is wrong. And if they had handled this right, they wouldn't be coming under the kind of pressure they're coming under. And I think they could have kept.
What are you thinking? What do you mean?
They could have kept the House and the Senate, whatever. When Biden came in, he wasn't casting himself as an FDR. He was casting himself as the simple, homey, build back better, calm antidote to Donald Trump. Yeah. Donald Trump was like a bull in a china shop. And Joe Biden was like the owner of the China shop.
Your point is he could never live up to that in the first place, so why even try?
Yeah, Biden was supposed to clean up the mess that Trump had left behind. Yeah. Biden wasn't supposed to renovate the place. He hadn't announced at the offset that he was going to massively redo everything. Yeah. That's something that the media did to him and something that he played along with because, it's exciting and it kind of fits, I think, adds a little bit of theater to what had been a snooze fest. Yeah. But that's not what he was originally intending. It's certainly not what his administration clearly is capable of doing. If he had stayed with, we're in a time of crisis. What I'm here to do, if you remember all of the fiascos that Trump caused, I'm here to bring some calm, stability, and a center to American politics. I want to bring us back to our center. Yeah. And I understand there are deep changes that we need to have in this country. But right now, we're in a moment of crisis. I think what we need to do is come together, come back to our basics, build back our economy from the basics, and then we'll have the strength to pursue vigorously some of the deeper innovations that our country needs. He could have done that kind of thing. He didn't do that. I think that would have worked a lot better.
What did he do instead of that?
He didn't say that much. And when he did come out, he was variously either lambasting Donald Trump or within the first couple of months, starting to make bigger and bigger promises, which granted is the tendency of any presidency. But if you can't do it, you can't do it. And you should make your messaging make sense. Yeah. Make it fit what you're able to do. You see what I'm saying?
Especially if you don't have the gumption to do it. Meaning, like, it's one thing to say, all right, we're going to get the PRO Act pass. All right, well, people are going to expect you to get the PRO Act pass. It's very specific. We're going to give it $15 an hour minimum wage. That's very specific. We're going to get marijuana off the scheduling. That's very specific. Yeah. Those are very specific things that you're talking about, right? The FDR thing, I don't think that was a media thing. I think that was a Biden thing. I think that was stuff that Democrats were leaking to try to make Biden seem more exciting, and the media just picked up on it and ran with it.
But is it a Biden thing or is it a Democrat Party thing?
Democratic Party thing. I think it's a little bit of both. I don't think I think the distinction between those two things are tenuous at best, if that makes sense. Either way, I think that was a party thing. I think they were like, let's add some pizzazz to Biden. Let's do all of that stuff. The problem is Biden is a puff of smoke. And like you say, he rarely was out there talking. When he did talk, he seemed to barely be able to do it. Doesn't have the ability to talk to anybody else but his typical press. Yeah. And even then, it's not like they criticize him or go after. It's very strange. So fair enough on that point. And yeah, I think I agree with you on that point about this notion of you do what you believe or you do what you say you can do, or you do what you can do, right?
You make the promises you can keep.
Promises you can keep.
Yeah.
But presidents often make promises they can't keep, and that's unfortunate. But in this case, he should have did that. He should have been the difference in this case.
It's okay if you make it. I'll put it like this: if you make 10 promises and you keep 6, 7 of them, that's okay. That's a good enough track record. People will forget the rest and forgive you for them. If you make 5 or 8 promises and you keep like 0 to 1 of them, that's a problem. People really notice.
That's a problem.
It's not enough to drown it out.
And by the way, it's not enough to just do the COVID bill.
Yeah.
I mean, Kamala Harris was like, the greatest moment in this administration was a COVID bill because that was the only thing you got passed.
Yeah.
And that was something that Trump was going to get passed. And so if that's the thing that you're chest thumping on, it's like, whoa, you're lacking stuff. Like you're missing stuff. Again, I keep bringing back 600,000 people have lost their lives. Like, this is not normal. This is in 1 year. This is in more wars. And you're talking about all of the retail that lost their businesses, all the people that had their lives screwed up. I guess my thinking is like, how do you come into this with this slow walk to normality? And if you're Joe Biden, yeah, you should keep your promises, especially when you have the capacity to do it. And so, yeah, I agree with you on that front. I don't agree with you on the power tool thing. We have parliaments all across the world. And if any of those parliaments had our government, they would have dissolved themselves long ago for inaction. You often have a government, something like the UK, France, pick any government, Israel, for example, they've dissolved themselves, 5 times at this point. The goal of it is for government to be active and to be able to function and to work. And it seems like in our system, not working is the height of democracy. And I have no idea why. Kristen Sinema wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post talking about, we need the filibuster. The filibuster is bipartisanship. The filibuster is this, the filibuster is that. It's like, are you insane? You're wrong in principle and practice. The Senate is already a minority body, meaning California, 2 senators, Iowa, 2 senators. California is the 5th largest economy, and yet 2 senators, meaning whatever takes place in the House and whatever advantages are given to the larger states because of the House, those things are eliminated in the Senate, because all of that stuff stops when that stuff says, all right, I don't agree with this. I'm a small state. I'm Iowa. I have 2 senators. I'm done. Period. That's what that goes to, right? Meaning the smaller states have
Iowa. What did Iowa? Iowa's not.
What? I'm saying Iowa gets 2 senators, just like California gets 2 senators. Okay, fair enough. You get my point, though. The smaller state says, we don't agree with this, and everything stops.
Yeah.
Parliaments function all across the world. And look, the Democratic Party had the House for 50 years almost. I think it was like maybe 2 years or 2 terms over the course of 50 years where they didn't have the House. When Bill Clinton came in and these guys started changing policies, well, all of a sudden stuff started going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. I would also make the point to you that when Trump came in, he had the House, he had the Senate, the presidency, and the Supreme Court, and yet Obamacare is still there, which means if a policy is put into place that is popular, those policies are far more difficult to get rid of, and those policies entail cost. It's the reason why Obamacare is still there. It's the reason why Medicare and Social Security are still there, despite the fact that Republicans have had the House, Senate, and Supreme Court and presidency over the course of their terms. You can screw with them. Don't get me wrong. You can undermine them. You can chip away at them. You can, try to undermine the post office to make the post office look bad so people can get annoyed at it where people aren't paying attention. You can mess around with Obamacare to make the rates go up. And you be like, hey, look at the rates. You can do all of that stuff to those things with the moving parts and everything else. But getting rid of it in one fell swoop is difficult and is politically unfeasible. So I get this notion that on some level around the edges where these guys are going to be removing policies, they're doing that now. They're doing it now. I don't even have to wait for them to get rid of the filibuster. That's what they're doing now.
It's true, but here's the difference between with the filibuster and that simple majority voting with us compared to other countries. The problem that a country like Israel has, for instance, just using their system as an example.
Mm-hmm. Use the UK. They have an upper chamber and a lower chamber too.
Sure, we can use them. It applies slightly less, but it still applies to them, which I think means that it's closer to a rule than an exception. The situation is, America has a 2-party system.
Right.
These countries, broadly speaking, have far more than 2 parties.
Yes.
With Israel being far more fractured than the UK, but even the UK, it's not just the Tories and Labour. There are other parties with,
liberal Democrats.
And there's ascension.
Greens.
If you think about the flow of current in an ocean with updrafts and downdrafts and things mixing around, it's the same thing with power to a greater extent in systems with more than 2 parties. You have, coalitions and individual organizations moving up and down and changing their positions, changing their sizes, changing who they align with, that kind of thing.
Right.
In America, it's different. We have 2 parties. Now, the disadvantages to that are voluminous, and we have brought them up consistently on this show. One big advantage, though, and I'll point out how it fits in with both this filibuster as a tactic and with something about America or Americanism as a whole. Yeah. One thing about 2 parties, one advantage they give you, if you have a tyrant, if you have somebody who makes a lot of bad decisions or somebody who comes into power and just runs amok, like, how most people view Donald Trump, for instance, but just take that kind of person, put them into office. Is it easier to get rid of them with a 2-party system or with a 5 or a 10-party system? And I'll give you the answer right now. It's far easier with a 2-party system because all of the opposition, I'll put it like this, the opposition, which would be in competition. Think about who doesn't like Donald Trump. Right. It's everybody from never Trumpers to some libertarians to like your standard liberal Democrat, to a lot of progressives, to plenty of centrists who don't like him for whatever social policy or whatever, what words he said about the Mexicans, whatever. My point is, these are not groups that naturally like each other. In a two-party system, however, what's their option? One other option. If Trump is a Republican, they vote with the Democrats. And even if they're not dissatisfied with them, this is something that Karl Popper wrote about, they're more likely to vote against this single person if they only have one option than if they're voting for a bunch of other people from different parties who have to create coalitions and, get over their grievances, all to come together against one figure, which is why for a figure like Netanyahu, he was able to sit in office in power despite being controversial because he was charismatic for over a decade. If it had been Likud and one other party, I think he probably would have been taken out far faster. And this is where it comes back to America and the filibuster and everything. What is America built around? The idea, even if it's superficial and just a veneer at this point, that we should be able to tear down unjust authority. Right. The idea that we should stop the government from becoming a big behemoth, like a Leviathan, that can overtake us and dominate our decisions and crowd out our individuality, that kind of thing. Which is why what are politicians tasked with? Not just growing the government, but also preventing it. What are the Republicans there to do? To keep the Democrats from their worst excesses. What are the Democrats there to do? To keep the Republicans from their worst excesses. And the filibuster, even though it's a self-inflicted wound, even though it's a double-edged sword that slices you at the same time as it slices your enemy, it's useful for keeping the other side from doing too much, which is exactly, I think, what America, in some sense, it's one of its quirks. It's one of our deep things.
One of his failings. It's one of his failings. There's always
yes, but it's a sort of autoimmune thing.
There's always a sliding door.
It's an autoimmune thing. That's what I'll say about
There's
it.
never a situation where there's always absolute perfection in regards to a particular position. There's always going to be something that you lose or something that you gain in regards to a particular process. Yeah. And in our process, intransigence is the rule. Intransigence is not getting things done.
Yeah, and at this point, it's a huge problem.
It's a problem. It's a big problem.
Stagnation.
I mean, think about the things that you think you might need to get done. I mean, just the very basic items that the American public agrees with. Just down, not even progressive or whatever else. What do you agree with? Do you believe America should have health care? Not even saying Medicare for all. Do you believe that government should apply? Overwhelming majority of people, yes, we believe this, especially after COVID. Yes, we believe this. Nothing can get done on that. Nothing can get done on that. It doesn't matter if one of the political parties says, yes, we want to do this. It doesn't matter if the overwhelming majority of the American public says, yes, we want this. It doesn't even matter if the overwhelming majority of the public tries to go and vote and put people in office to do that. Because of gerrymandering, because of all this other stuff, you still would get one guy, no, going home. That's a problem. That is a horrible, horrible problem. And if getting rid of the filibuster on some level allows me action while I lose this notion of intransigence, I don't even buy this argument of it's easier to get rid of a tyrant. I don't buy that. If the guy is a tyrant and he is legitimately a tyrant, then you would ideally the people will work towards getting rid of the tyrant. I mean, in this country, we have more than one party.
But if they're also a demagogue, then the lines start to get very blurry for people.
Blurry. But you would agree with me that there are Greens in this country, there are Libertarians in this country, and in the same way, let's say something like in the UK, you might have two major parties, meaning let's say Labour and Conservatives. Those are the major parties, and the other parties sublimate themselves on some level into the voting and everything else of those major parties. You can make an argument that AOC is not a classic Democrat, or Sanders is not a classic Democrat, despite the fact they have to sublimate themselves in. Or let's say there's some Greens, or some outright socialists who might be running in the Democratic Party because they can't necessarily find anything else. Those people, despite the fact that they're running as Democrats, are, on some level, not Democrats. I hope you understand what I mean. It's like philosophically, those people are different just because they're calling themselves that, just in the context of running in a race. I understand your point that if you're fracturing, so let's say an opposition or something like that, then you have much more harder time to get rid of, let's say, somebody who's horrible. By the same token, I don't necessarily want to run a political system with the worst in mind. Meaning, I'm not running a political system with the idea that everything that I'm doing is to prevent a demagogue.
I'm not here to sing apologetics for the American government or whatever.
Sounds like it. Sounds like it.
I know, screw you, man. No, it doesn't. And you know exactly where.
Apology for the filibuster.
No, you know exactly where I'm coming from. What I'm saying is, it fits with our vibe. It fits with how we do things. It fits with how we feel about things. Yeah. What Americans fundamentally, one of our big concerns, and I'm not trying to say this in either a pro or a con sense, is keeping the government from doing bad things to us. We have a sort of valid fear, I think, because again, even though we were born as aristocrats, America, I mean, not all of us individually.
No.
Even though we were born as aristocrats, we were born in defiance to some larger aristocracy. The whole idea of America is pushing back against perceptions of unjust authority, even when you yourself are privileged up the wazoo and when you have more than you need or whatever. This idea that some larger authority, some larger tyranny is coming down to keep you from making money or to keep you from doing well or whatever, and trying to push back and keep that from happening. That's what we bring to our government. So the idea of the filibuster, that being a thing that we use, it's now one exception to this and one argument that you could use to cut against me. I'm going to point people again to this website. I'd recommend going to check it out. What WTF happened in 1971? Were you here when I found out about this and started talking about this? This might have been last week with Austin. It's a website. WTF happened in 1971.com. Right. And those are the numbers in 1971. WTF happened in 1971.com. Great website. I like list of charts. And if you look at cloture and the uses of cloture in Congress, and if you look at the use of the filibuster, when does it accelerate? As far as I can tell.
Well, I told you after they got rid of that rule where you can have multiple things.
Yes. And now why does that happen? What is this indicative of? What does this point to in our society? I would argue that it points to a deeper financial malaise and a deeper sort of political malaise caused by financial decisions made by our government that are also simultaneously, economics is ideology. If you make a financial decision, or a monetary decision about how your country's monetary policy works, you're choosing where your state is headed. You're choosing what your state's orientation is in the space of politics and geopolitics. I would argue that from the early 70s on, we changed our motivations and our ambitions and where we were going, what we were orienting ourselves towards. We started to make some seriously bad decisions. Our leaders got corrupt and dilapidated and, kind of intellectually decrepit in a couple of ways. And we're still living on the fumes from that. And that's where we're pushing. We got calls.
Okay. But just to be very clear, I haven't necessarily heard a decent argument for keeping the filibuster.
I'm not arguing for or against. Well, I'm saying I guess
my point is
we would use it against
ourselves.
ourselves.
A problem.
We would use it against ourselves.
Well, I get from the standpoint of American. I don't even know if I accept that from American ideology. It's, as American as apple pie. I don't even know if I buy that. I mean, I would say this: environments change, and at one point where you had Mr. Smith goes to Washington, and you could trust these guys to do that. Fair enough. There's no issue at the filibuster at that point, right? People use it whenever they need it, but it's rare. It's not something that becomes part of the political system. The moment where Congress gets to the point where 60 votes is the threshold, then there's a problem and needs to get rid of. Either you need to get rid of it or you need to change it, one or the other. Or you should not leave it.
Or Congress needs to find a way to agree with itself a lot more. Because if Congress were able to agree on important issues.
I don't know how Congress does that.
Well, that's the thing. And that's where it comes back to the financial thing. What happens when the pie stops growing in a system, in a democratic system? Just think about it for a second. If the pie starts shrinking.
There's going to be conflict, right? Especially, and even before the pie starts shrinking, if people are pulling more and more from it where people are getting less and less, of course you're going to get conflict.
Now, imagine for a second if the pie is still growing and it's growing kind of quickly. Well, then what do you have? You have less scarcity. And this isn't just a spiritual thing or a woo thing or whatever. Yeah. You have more future resources available to grab. Any investments you can place now will gain you a return that will grow over time in a sort of compounding sense, which means that everybody in that system has reason to be optimistic. And nobody has a reason to sort of, okay, I'm going to crowd out. I'm going to force everybody else to get zero share of the pie because I can expect that my pie will grow, I'll do well, et cetera, et cetera. Everybody can sort of invest themselves in that system. I would argue that from the early 70s onward, arguably before, maybe later, this pie stopped growing. We've been hiding it over. The political system has been feeding off this completely. And the filibuster, what that represents is politicians living in a state of sort of political scarcity, where the United States GDP growth has been low. Inflation has either been suppressed. We had to deal with stagflation back in the 70s, or, quantitative easing more recently. Politicians are aware of that peripherally in a sort of subliminal sense. We're all living in this system. And they particularly, if the pie were growing, if America were doing gangbusters economically and elsewhere, I think politics would be a lot more common. Politicians would agree on a lot more. And something like a $15 an hour minimum wage, assuming inflation matched or whatever, or universal health care. If America had a lot more money floating around and people were feeling more optimistic and confident, I don't think that would be nearly as big a deal. But as it is, filibuster is something we use to keep other people from taking more of the pie. You use to consolidate your power, and you use to slow the sort of rate of pie consumption down.
I agree that it's used to slow politics down, 1,000%, which is why I want to get rid of it. I mean, whatever the reason, like you can make an argument that, like Thomas Franks makes the argument that business recognized that labor unions, that these guys started getting a lot more power after the FDR era, and that, these guys are increasing their wages, these guys are expanding unionship, do all of this stuff. Yeah. And this is a problem for us as business going forward. We need to mitigate that. And there was a conscious effort to basically roll back that tide of, let's say, economic progress from the standpoint of business and from standpoint of workers and this kind of worker power stuff. And this was even shown in the Democratic Party with this kind of separation of the unions from the political space. Because understand, the moment that you disassociate, let's say, unions from, let's say, the Democratic Party, you no longer have a situation where workers, the poor, and the vehicles that workers and the poor use to kind of engage in this kind of political discourse have become effectively disconnected from the political scene. Well, if you're not talking to unions and the workers and the poor, who are you talking to? And if you're spending 75% of your time begging for cash, who are you talking to? Meaning it's a fight among elites at this point. And so I get your point of like, well, if the pie was growing and everything else, that's not a pie that we're fighting for. That's a pie that they're fighting for. And you could say that there are different sets of elites that the Democrats are backing versus Republicans. Fair enough. And that they're, using filibuster back and forth in order to, fair enough. Or their own priorities. But keep in mind, some of this stuff is being used not just for financial stuff. I mean, the filibuster, politics has seemed to got to the point, however it's gotten here, that it is zero sum. And if that means, the opposition party is not going to work with the party in power.
Yeah, I would say, I can't. What's the other? Again, economics is the basis that makes most sense for me. I'll just leave it like that.
Yeah.
But Newt Gingrich, the timing, again, within a couple of decades, you would see the political changes that you expect from the economics.
No. I don't think I am entirely disagreeing with the economics thing. I'm saying I don't know
whatever the cause is.
Right. Whatever the cause is.
Politics.
I feel like that might be a little bit too simplistic to kind of explain why their behavior. Yeah.
There's this tweet that I identified with a while back. I'm going to paraphrase it horribly, but it's like everything is monocausal. Everything is caused by one thing, and that one thing is whatever I'm really into.
Exactly,
right. It's like whatever I'm excited about right now.
I think there's an economic thing for it. I think there's a business interest where business needed to basically assert itself over what it considered to be these kind of worker rights and everything else. Let's go to a caller.
We got a caller. Mitch calling in from Greece. Mitch, you're on the line. Great to hear from you. What's on your mind?
Thank you, guys. Thank you for my minute of notoriety. My classes, the classes that I took at the university, they always remind me something. When we talk about a two-party system in America, I think that's a misnomer. The reason is because each state has its own party. So we're talking about, with the territories, let's say 110 parties altogether. You see, my theory is that the Democratic Party of Alaska must be much different from the Democratic Party in Puerto Rico. They have different agendas. So sure, there are some flag-bearing causes like abortion where they always agree, those parties. But how does that affect the average person as far as their everyday living goes? That's when you need your health coverage, your jobs, and so on. This is why I don't agree with this notion that there's a two-party system in America. It's rather those two parties are coalitions of factions that may not be connected among themselves. And, if you take it like in Europe, they have a very weird way of gerrymandering by which they allocate votes, not on the basis of one person, one vote, but by some weird formula. And let me give you an example in Greece. One vote for the Communist Party, yes, we have one of those. It is equal in the last elections to two votes for the other leftist parties, and then 3 votes for the conservatives, which are in power right now. That's called gerrymandering Greek style. It doesn't work because parties here are not coalitions. They are not coherent. They're just diverse ideologies, and it has nothing to do with governing people. That is all that I had to say.
Well, look, I would agree with you on that. I mean, and look, I would even go further. I don't even believe there are two parties in the United States. I think there's just one. And then, just because there's, two sides of that bird and they may squawk a particular way, but all intents and purposes, whether it's on military, whether it's on finance, economics, et cetera, across the board, these guys basically agree. There's a very small window of stuff that they kind of fight over and blow up. But on the grand contours, I mean, it's not like Trump is saying something, Biden has come out saying something radically different. Biden has appropriated multiple Trump policies either from the standpoint of China, but you can say Trump appropriated Obama's policy on China in regards to we need to make a pivot to China. On the border, when you kind of walk that back. I mean, even Afghanistan. Like, this is from neocon Joe Biden, right?
And that's another consequence of the weird zero-sum nature of the thing is that you need to, like, each party, in order to most clarify itself as being superior to the other party, needs to oppose it on the grounds of pretty much everything.
Yes.
Unless it's literally the most commonsensical thing, like I like America,
Right.
or unless it's the most bedrock.
Rape is
of,
bad.
Exactly.
Yes,
that kind
yes.
of bedrock of shared foundations.
We agree with that.
We all agree with that.
agree with that,
No, any sane person, 99.999% of Americans are going to agree with these policies. Exactly. And what that means is they agree with each other, they disagree with each other over some things that don't make sense. And then when they come in, they have to copy each other because the thing that makes sense to do is the thing the other administration was doing, but they had to disagree with it to give their show of voice, show of force. Anyway, we need to close this hour out. You guys have been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, coming back with headlines and another 2 hours of this morning show. We'll be right back on the other side of this short break.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am your ever-vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That means you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Good segment. Personally, I am partial to those talking segments. I like it.
Yeah.
I like the back and forth.
Yeah.
I like the banter or the conversation. Sometimes it goes in really interesting places where it doesn't necessarily take off. I was listening to our conversation yesterday on, I think we started off on aliens, and it just went all the way through the monologue, all the way through the end. I sat there and listened to the entire thing. I was like, wow, that was a good conversation.
We talked about a lot of stuff there.
Yeah.
We talked about
Because it went from like aliens to this notion of rights to this notion of, and it's a logical continuation, right? Because it's this kind of philosophical basis of, okay, what do you expect from blah, 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 blah. And it's like at the very end of it, I think we're talking about like rights and what, like God-given and that type of stuff, like some really heady stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that was a really good conversation.
It's true. We tend to get there when we're just talking between ourselves because there's nothing to more us do this earth.
Yeah.
There's nothing, there's no leash that's like, okay, you guys got to stay on this topic. Like there's with a guest where it's like, if we start talking about rights and Grodias or whatever and God. And
the guest is like, what are we?
Unless it's Mark Frost.
For Ron.
Unless it's Mark Frost. Yeah. He'll go with us anywhere. Yeah. Which we were coincidentally speaking with in a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, I've been having more fun listening to the show, like just listening back to it.
Yeah.
After it's done. Since we've been back in studio and able to have those kinds of conversations. I think it's been better.
It was quite good. Better. I even put it on my channel yesterday. I was like, wow. Because it was the Scientific America article. And I was like, all right, I want to do a video on that. I was like, but the video I did on it, on Fault Lines, was the video.
Yeah.
Like, that was like, there's nowhere to go from that outside of that video.
Yeah.
I was like, just put the video up. And as I watched it, I was like, oh my God, that video is so good. Go watch it, guys. It was yesterday on Fault Lines. It's very good. All right, let's get to the headlines. In the news. About 12,773 new COVID cases were reported in the United States yesterday, with about 432 new deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of about 11,370 cases per day, a decrease of 21% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 45% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 53% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 33,537,764 unfortunate human beings in the United States and has killed an even more unfortunate 602,164 mothers, fathers, daughters, and sons. Great. The United States is expected to not NOT, hit the 70% adult vaccination rate by July 4th, a goal set by the president and now acknowledged by the administration as unlikely. Currently, about 65% of American adults have received at least one COVID shot. Got to get more pickup trucks and shotguns. Eric Adams is in first, and Maya Wiley is in second in a New York City mayoral race with about 85% of the votes in and about 9-point margin between the two. Andrew Yang, also a 2016 presidential candidate, dropped out first from the race. Ranked choice voting is being tested in the vote for the first time, and the results apparently are not expected for like a week. This is going to be interesting to watch. And I know people, especially on the left, really applaud ranked choice voting, especially progressives, because in our head, that allows us a way of not being stuck with this dichotomy of, well, if you don't vote for this person, this other monster wins. However, New York is putting this to the test. And on some level, there's a level of complication associated with it that's not necessarily there. Doesn't make it bad, just means be aware. 4 Saudi Arabian operatives who participated in the killing of journalist Jamarl Khashoggi were given paramilitary training in the United States. The State Department funded program. Great. Spain has pardoned 9 jail Catalan independence leaders convicted in 2017 who were serving sentences of 9 to 13 years. We should come back to that. That's interesting. Northern Ethiopia is reportedly the site of ongoing fierce fighting, with Tigrayan rebels saying they've taken towns and encircling the capital, which the Ethiopian government has denied. And last, the Taliban has seized 50 districts in northern Afghanistan since May of this year, accelerating its takeover as the United States has announced plans and a timeline for withdrawing its troops from the country. Those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I'm going to go into this article. This is Axios. Parties pounce on China as a midterm issue. I'll just read it. Democrats and Republicans in purple states are already leaning into U.S. competition with China as a key issue in the fight to control the Senate in 2022. Why it matters. American voters hold increasingly negative feelings towards the Chinese government, particularly about bilateral economic relations following the nation's handling of the COVID-19 outbreak. I had a very interesting conversation yesterday with one of my nurses. The woman is very, very nice. Even though I have strained relationships with nurses and doctors, it doesn't necessarily mean I don't necessarily recognize that they care. And in this very specific situation, I also care about their well-being. And she is from Manila. She is not Chinese, and yet America doesn't know the difference. She asked me, why does black people hate Chinese? It's like, what do you mean? Why do black people hate Chinese people? Well, I'm watching television, and I saw a black person punch a Chinese person. Why do blacks hate Chinese? As if I'm the black whisperer in this situation, right? And I make the point to her, I am greatly doubtful that blacks dislike Chinese. I know of no black person that dislikes Chinese people implicitly. The point I made to her is that while you may be seeing stuff like that on television and everything else, blacks only make up 13% of the population. And I would be curious to know what the statistics are in regards to violence and who's permitting the violence and everything else. And I wouldn't necessarily take just one video image of it. On top of that, the point that I also made to her is that your issue is not any one individual act of violence. Your issue is that the U.S. government has screamed to the top of the mountain that China is committing genocide. Not just that China is committing genocide, that China was responsible for the China virus, that they were putting Chinese people on airplanes in order to throw out with parachutes in order to infect God-fearing Americans as they went about their hard work during productivity and labor. That's what they were doing, those communist Chinese people. That's what was taking place. That is what is being pumped out into the American airwaves. And even before, they caused COVID. They infected you with this virus. 600,000 of you died because of the Chinese. And look at them. Their communist country was able to shut themselves down and protect themselves, where we, hardworking Americans, wanted to go out to work, so 600,000 of us have died. It's their fault. That's the nonsense that gets populated on the airwaves. And even before that, you had this argument that the Chinese people are stealing our jobs. They're taking our jobs. They're stealing our intellectual property. That's what they're doing. That's nonsense. So you have this pumped into the airwaves for years. And guess what happens? Predictably, the perspective from the United States of Chinese people tilt to the negative. Go look at the stats. They are appalling in regards to how low those stats are in the way that America perceives Asians or Chinese. The catch here is Americans don't know who is Chinese. They see somebody who's Japanese, that person's Japanese, that person's Chinese. This woman from Manila, Nicaragua, that person's Chinese. They don't know. So she is terrified. She's fearful. What am I supposed to do in this situation? How am I supposed to deal with the situation where I think people are out to get me, where I think my life is in threat? When I look on the television, I'm seeing people getting beat up or hurt, and I'm hearing the press, the media tell me that China is doing all of these things, that I am not even Chinese. And yet, I am concerned. It has consequences. When people are pushing this nonsense or stuff out on the airwaves, and they're acting as if, it just goes out to the ether, and it does, just disintegrates. Russiagate didn't disintegrate. And the stuff that we're putting out about China for our own insecurities, for our own failings, for our own inability to get things done in regards to dealing with stuff in this own country, the investment in this country. Joe Biden is making an argument right now that instead of doing things because Americans deserve it, because they are Americans and we have value and the country recognizes that Americans have value, no, it's because of the Chinese. You got to compete with the Chinese. My point here is that these things have larger consequences. And so when I see an article in Axios, parties pounce on China as a midterm issue in the way that they've been pouncing on them about the jobs, and pouncing on them about COVID, and pouncing on them about the genocide, and pouncing on them about the military expenditures and the increase. Oh, China has been beefing up their military. 800 bases around the world. China beefing up their military. This is what is pumped out into the media. And that's what I told her. I said, your issue here is that Western media, especially in the U.S., has oriented itself to consider China an enemy. And because the American justice or education system is not that great, and you have a lot of people who are not that bright, they can't tell a difference between you, Japanese, or, for that matter, Chinese. I was very angry talking to her. Not at her, more so at the situation. She's very nice woman. And she's like bewildered by the whole thing. I'm not even Chinese. And it's not like she's like, yeah, I'm okay with the Chinese. No, it's like, what is wrong with you people? It's that. And I'm like, she said, so if people are doing that, they're insane. I say, yeah, they're nuts. I say, they're absolutely nuts. I say, on some level, they're being propagandized to constantly, either subconscious or otherwise. I mean, for God's sake, if you heard the Chinese are committing genocide, now, sane and rational people may look at that and say, okay, well, China doing that. Let's say they're just believing the overt narrative of the stuff. China is doing that. What about people who are not entirely sane and rational? And what those people say, your people are killing these other people, which on some level in their weird head justifies actions against them. People are nuts. I mean, it's not a situation where everybody is sane and rational. And even in the context of people not being sane and rational, they're not even bright enough to get the target right. It's very bizarre. And I don't think we entirely get how that stuff settles into human beings when that stuff is put out there like that. And, consequences, consequences is that Asian person gets attacked, that Asian person gets assaulted, that person who's not even Asian, who's Hispanic, who just so happened look Asian when you squint, gets assaulted. It's that nonsense. That's problematic. And it bothers me. I put it that way. It bothers me. I brought this issue up about the Asian thing, I think months ago when it was first starting. And you could see the numbers of hate crimes. You could see the sentiment towards Asian rise and everything else. And after that conversation with her, I was pissed. Livid.
Isn't there, and this is maybe one of the more controversial things genuinely that I say or have said, but isn't there actually an affinity between certain black subcommunities and Chinese subculture, specifically there's Wu-Tang Clan. There are some fairly prominent hip hop groups. I'm not even kidding.
I love Wu-Tang Clan. And Wu-Tang Clan is
nerds who are really into Hong Kong, kung fu films, that kind of thing. That's isn't that a big, exactly. That's my point.
To put it in this perspective, right? RZA, one of my favorite rap artists, makes a movie. Russell Crowe is in it. Man with the Iron Fist.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
He gets his arm cut off and replaced with Iron Fist. And he becomes a kung fu guy. It's like he's living out his.
That's all that I'm saying. I just wanted to start out with that because I thought that was. And
then he rapped on his own movie, which.
Oh, that's awesome. No, I haven't seen that. That's cool though. Okay, so it's worth noting for the gazillionth time here that the United States tried an experiment which did not work. That experiment, namely, taking the elephant in the room, which is racism, and just throwing a rug over it.
Yeah.
And calling that sweeping it under the rug.
Yeah.
Like, okay, ignore this decorative, statue in the corner that's still moving and wriggling and vaguely alive, that kind of thing. And that we were like, okay, multiculturalism.
Yeah.
We're good to go. Let's move on to the next issue. And that did not work, to be clear. And, we're still, ethnic tensions are like the most prominent kind of tension you can deal with, arguably. We're still riddled with them, and it's still a problem around the globe. And of course, it's weaponized. We weaponize it when it makes sense to, from decade to decade, even though we'd like to talk about moral progress or the wave of history or whatever, being on the right side of things. And it makes sense that we're going to sign on to that. And there's anyway,
it's unfortunate. That's all.
That's how I like to deal with that.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. And Biden will come out and be like, hey, the Asian community, we're right here with you.
Yes.
And then immediately China's committing genocide. And they don't see how saying, look, this entire group is committing genocide. However, we're backing China. You can't have it both ways. But the moment that you said this group is committing genocide, it trickles down. People are going to make this association between what you're saying from the standpoint of the genocide, or from the standpoint of taking their jobs, or from the standpoint of spreading. Like all of this stuff is being put out there from the standpoint of this is the U.S. press. Why wouldn't the public respond? And why are you shocked that the public is behaving in the way that the press is putting out?
Well, and as Americans who've set foot overseas know, those, the actions of your nation, here's the thing, they simultaneously do cast aspersions upon where you're coming from.
Yes,
Americans who travel overseas see how, preconceptions about Americans, stereotypes, superficial, how they're going to behave, commercialistic, vain, self-obsessed,
loud,
caught up in their own reality, belligerent, those kinds of things. Those preconceptions that other countries have, they have for a reason. I'm not even saying they're right. But I'm saying what it should give us is like an awareness, and what I think it does give us is an awareness. What it's said about our country, what our country does, is going to affect how people view us.
Yes.
And what's screwed up to me about the situation with China, yes, Andre, we'll be going to a break very soon here. Screwed up about the situation with China is that, okay, take the most plausible set of events in which there was a lab leak. As far as I can tell, the U.S. is culpable for it, which means that what we've had for the last year and a half at this point, almost, year plus, is first Donald Trump, then Joe Biden, vilifying China, Donald Trump blaming it on China, now seeing a boomerang with the narrative about it being a lab leak coming back around and suddenly being orthodoxy in the media. It's all set against China, when the most plausible scenario in which it was in some sense China's fault, the United States was funding the very lab, as far as I can tell, it's being claimed that this thing came from. So either way, our feet are dirty too. We've got plenty of egg in our face or whatever. But, we're focusing on the mote that's in their eye. Yeah. That seems to be the status quo. We need to go to a break here. Yeah. But I'm worried that, like so many other things, it's kind of we're seeing the evidence of it in the rising hate crimes and changing cultural attitudes. Anyway, we're going into a break. Coming back with Mark Frost, talking politics, economics, changing job situation in America, and more congressional politics too. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're talking economics and the changing job situation, as we want to do, as we often do, with our guest, Mark Frost, who is, by the way, an economist, professor, economics professor, a consultant, a drummer, an Eagle Scout, a Marine, a capitalist, a Schumpeterian, a recovering libertarian, and an adjective. Mark, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
You guys are never going to let me live that description down.
Hey, no, I'm sorry. I keep bringing it. We could edit it, too. We're doing it to ourselves at this point, really. It's not even, I don't even think you officially requested it. We inherited the format from your Twitter bio, I believe, and have just sort of kept it up. Where, you just described yourself using some different terms, and we've definitely kept it going. And I'm happy to, because it's, it gives us, and in some sense, it fits what we'd like to talk with you about, which is a lot of different stuff. Even though we're going in a specific direction. Mark, thanks again for being with us this morning. You sent me an article the other day, wage gains, I'm quoting this from the Wall Street Journal, wage gains at factories fall behind growth in fast food. And Jamarl and I were talking about this idea before the show started, I believe, this morning. I thought people were leaving the services sector. So if people are leaving jobs in the services industry, the title of the article mentions fast food. They're not going into factories if wages are falling. Why would they go into factories if they're they're already leaving the workplace in general, or if they're switching industries? Where are they going? What's going on here? Why are we not seeing a return to manufacturing despite the promises of both Biden and Trump? First, Mark, what do you see happening here?
Sure, let me answer that. But first, let me tell you, I love Mr. Thomas's wonderful work from Europe.
Oh, yeah.
I think that we're starved. I mean, I felt almost ignorant hearing what he had to say relative to what our own media has to say.
Oh, Mark, thank you, man.
Just said, wow.
You're too kind. I was excited, man. When you are like on cloud nine and immersed in politics, it's like you're in heaven. Like I could have dropped it right there and be like, I'm the happiest man alive. It was that. It's like when you're excited about it, it comes out. And it's like this kind of, because on some level, you're an American, and I don't like this hysteria. I mean, part of my, before I even got to this channel, I was very in the camp of we need to bring down hostility around the world in regards to what we're doing. And so you have this meeting where the U.S. and Russia come together to talk. And what's wild about it, it's like, okay, it seems that at the very least, there's a meeting of the minds that maybe we shouldn't kill each other. Maybe there should be some basic, framework of development and everything else. That's not the way the Western media was looking at that, though. They had a very specific opinion and a disposition, and that opinion and disposition was being asked in every question that was being asked. And even in the way that Biden had to talk about that stuff, he had to, I have to be very strong in the beginning. But eventually I'm going to get to my point. And, there was a few tidbits that Biden was dropping when he was basically mirroring Putin's speech, or even bringing up China. Meaning, again, trying to rally the world against China, this kind of existential threat from the standpoint of the USS. No, it was a fascinating conference. And it got that much more fascinating when Biden came on and gave his speech. Because initially I was like, oh, God, Mindy is right. This is going nowhere. And then after he started talking, and I realized there's no other press there, there's just American media. It's like, oh, God, this is going nowhere. But then after he started mirroring Putin's speech, I was like, oh. This is interesting. And then I realized whether there was foreign press there or not was almost kind of irrelevant. That wasn't his point. His point wasn't to get into these kind of back and forth debates with various media as they were pointing out the hypocrisy of the American position. No, his point was to solidify this need that, look, we need to have somewhat of a pragmatic, predictable relationship with Russia. And by the way, anything that we want to get accomplished in the world, be it climate change, be it, dealing with China, dealing with Iran, dealing with any of these things, JCPOA, the works, you're going to need Russia to help you, including Syria. We're nose to nose. Like, there's video out there right now where Russia and the U.S., like Russia's like heading off the U.S. in Syria. That's how close the militaries are interacting with one another. Hypersonic weapons that gives no lead time. Like, these are big deals. And our media is only concerned with whether or not you hit them hard enough. It was unfortunate, Mark. Like, it was greatly unfortunate to watch that. It was greatly aggravating to watch that, and embarrassing on some level. So I appreciate that. Thank you, man.
Sure. And, from an economics perspective, I started I was just finishing up my undergraduate degree when the Soviet Union fell.
Interesting.
All we heard about was peace dividend, peace dividend, peace dividend. Well, I'm still waiting for the peace dividend. And we had pinhead economists go over there and act like you can magically transport American-style democratic capitalist framework into a society which has only known feudalism and communism.
Yeah.
And because institutions matter, how you set those things up. And we've been damaging that country, I believe, from an ideological perspective, ever since the Soviet Union fell. I don't know if I've told you guys before, but about 3 years ago, I took a train. The rule was no planes, no airports, no planes, but I took ground transportation only from London to Singapore. And the vast majority of that trip, or at least half of it, was through Russia.
Yeah, it's a huge country.
And I met the people, not the people at the airports. I met the people in a village, and I liked it, and I'd stay an extra day. And I saw how they lived, and I saw just kind of the general attitude. And all our media can seem to do is Russia bad, Putin bad man. It's almost kind of like if back, many journalists, if Trump said 2 + 2 = 4, they would have a problem with math.
Yeah.
Trump said it.
Yeah.
And it's almost like that way with Russia. I'm not here to defend Putin or any of that sort of thing because I don't know the machinations that go behind there. What I do know is an American-style governance in the ex-Soviet Union would be chaos.
It would not work, and it didn't work.
Yeah.
And for a time, it seemed like the United States took the world effectively not just as its playground, but also as its laboratory, where we were trying out various economic experiments. Some of them maybe, veiled as actual just geopolitical projects, like what we did in Chile, for instance, economic shock therapy. Yeah. The Friedman School, the Chicago School, applied abroad, again, talking about either Chile or talking about Russia, where, like the instances, the 90s, the instances that you're talking about, the whole economic crash and crisis, that mode. I'm curious, Mark, when did you do that trip, the trans?
It would have been 2016, summer of 2000.
Pretty recent.
This was recent.
Pretty recent.
Yeah, so 5 years ago, yeah.
Wow.
I was okay because that could have been. You're sowing your wild oats. It's the 80s or the 90s, and you're like,
I thought this was like 20 years ago. I didn't realize this was
this is
recent.
pretty recent. This is post Maidan.
That's phenomenal. How long was the trip again?
Right at 2 months, but I wasn't in a hurry. The whole point was to just to experience for myself because I finally had the time to do it. And it was something I've been wanting to do anyway because I read about the possibility of it online like 10 years ago.
Yeah.
I'm going to do that someday. It was on a bucket list, so to speak.
Yeah.
Let me tell you what happened. It would never happen here in the United States. I had budgeted, when you travel that way, you can't be a typical American. You can't say, the train's not supposed to be here at 6 p.m. and
you can't do that.
15 p.m. I'm stressing.
Can't do that.
They don't even run at all. You have to be fluid. I'm telling you, more often than not, I only spent half of my hotel, hostel, motel type budget because people invited me into their house. I never once stayed in a hotel in Russia. Not one time.
So it's interesting. When I was in the Middle East, I had a little bit of that, but I was far more wary of it, only because I was traveling by myself. And so it was kind of like this thing of, like, for example, in Egypt, I think I was in Dahab, and, it's like 2, 3 in the morning. I've been talking to this guy for like 3 hours, just standing outside, pitch black. He's like, hey, why don't you come into the house? Come into the house. House is pitch black. There's like dogs bark. It's like, yeah, thank you, man. But Jordan, similar thing where it's like you get to the hotel, 2 in the morning, the guy calls, is like, hey, Jamarl. Like, yeah, what are you doing? Like, dude, I've been traveling for like 20 hours. It's 3 in the morning. Want some wine and cheese? Dude, it's 3 in the morning. I appreciate that. Like, it's that, right? Or people are like, hey, I just want to talk to you to see what you sound like. That type of stuff. Or Israel, believe it or not.
Yes.
I mean, like, it's travel is real. It's eye-opening. I'm curious about your experience. When you were going to the people's houses, how did you deal with the language barrier, or if there was a language barrier? Did you have any issue associated with, okay, well, look, I always have issues being okay with allowing people to do things for me. It screws with me, especially if I have to ask. I would sit there. I'll tell you the story to get across how deep this goes. When I was I think I was 18, 19 years old, I developed kidney failure when I was 17. And so I went immediately to college after developing kidney failure. Don't do that, by the way. You're 17 years old. You're sowing your royal oats. So it's like sex, alcohol, pot, a little bit of schooling. One of the things, though, is because of that, you're dealing with like your body going through these kind of weird changes that you have to accommodate. I am doing this thing called CAPD. It's continuous ambulatory peritoneal dialysis. And what that means is they put in a solution into your peritoneal cavity, and the solution uses diffusion or osmosis in order to pull, let's say, waste material and fluid while pulling out sugar into the other part of your body, which means that your peritoneal cavity fills up with fluid. Here's the catch. If the solution is too strong and your body doesn't have the fluid, then your body starts to cramp radically so because your body doesn't have the fluid. And that thing continues to pull despite the fact that your body continues to cramp. Now, I screwed up this morning. Walking back from class, freezing, it's snowing out, maybe a foot, 2 feet of snow. I cramp up before I can get to my room, before I can even get into the building, before I even get maybe a block away. And instead of asking for help, I just sit there in the snow. And I'm thinking to myself, like, all right, how do you get out of this? As if you can think your way out of this very specific situation. And it's like, I think maybe 5 or 10 minutes pass, and I'm like, man, I'm screwed. And finally, these guys pull up the guy that I met just on a whim, on a passing. He was like, hey, you're okay? No. It took everything in me to tell him no. In which case, they carried me to the car and took me to the doctor. But I guess the point I'm making, it goes deep. Like, it's very hard to accept that like that. How did you get over that? I mean, you're engaging with all of these different people. Like you say, you rarely had to stay in these other places. That means you were staying with strangers, basically. What was the language like, or the communication between you two? How was that mediated? And on top of that, what was those stays like?
Sure. One of the reasons that motivated me to do this, and I'm going to answer your question, but I have to tell you the process. I'll take 15 seconds to tell you.
Go for it.
I read a book by Harville Hendrix called Receiving Love, and it has a little test in it. I maxed out the giving love. I'm good at giving people love. I made a 4. I scored a 4 on receiving love. And so just like what you said, it's difficult for me to allow other people to do something for me, even though I'll eagerly do something for you.
Yes.
I realize that's a form of emotional narcissism in a certain way, and I was determined to change. And
well, wait a minute. I thought about that. I wondered whether that was narcissism. I even wondered whether it was an insecurity on this notion of responsibility, meaning by not holding other people responsible in regards to the way you relate to them, that you let them off the hook in a certain way. I don't know if that's narcissism. I mean, is that considered? I mean, you tell me. I'm sorry. I'm interrupting. I've thought about this myself, so please continue.
Yeah, Hendricks argues that it's actually a form of a control issue, and he also further argues there are no control issues. There's only trust issues masquerading as control issues.
Yeah.
So hyper-controlling people, and I wasn't controlling in the sense of you must stand here, you must go there, you have to eat here. I wasn't like that. I was controlling in the sense that I didn't trust that other people could make the right decision. And doing that trip broke that. Whatever I was already trying to get rid of that side of my personality, or at least mitigate it, but that trip just killed it, because if you're going to do something like that, you have no choice but to trust strangers.
Yeah, you have no choice but to trust strangers. And when strangers, without even an invitation, often reward any hope or expectation, any sort of even unconscious faith that you have. Okay, people are good. When they do that kind of thing for you without you asking for anything, without thinking about it, it gives you trust. It gives you trust in humanity. I've had a little bit of that. But, everything you're saying there about control and trust, that makes perfect sense. Of course, it's fundamentally isolating, which is one of the sadder things about refusing to take help or refusing to even ask for it, having that kind of neurosis or whatever. But it's true, because Jamarl, you're chuckling, but it is kind of a neurosis. It's like, oh, I don't want to ask for it. I'm not going to do that. I've had that myself. My brother has had that. I think that's just something that people have, of course, but it is fundamentally a trust issue. Are they going to do that? Are they actually going to help me? How are they going to feel about me while they're doing this? How is this going to, affect us? I
assume that they don't want to, I assume that they are not going to want to while they're doing it.
Yeah.
Those are my assumptions, right?
Well, and those can be safe. Those are safe, but the thing that's a kind of control. It's an expectation of that gives you a sense of control over your psychological environment.
Yes.
I'm not going to ask. They're not going to reject
It's very
me.
clear cut in the sense of what is taking place. Meaning
Exactly.
my world is solid.
But the problem with that, of course, is that it keeps you away from other people. And there are certain people who love
Some
you,
level, yeah.
and not just your
That's
parents,
it
but
right
your
there.
friends. There are certain people who love you and who will help you. And there are certain people who are willing to act like they love you, even when they don't know you that well. And that's something really miraculous about humanity, if you think about it for a second. People who are willing to extend themselves and able to help, willing and able and ready to help you with it without you being at all aware of it, without an invitation or anything like that. And again, it's the reward that you get. But I think the reasonable middle ground is if somebody wants to help you, that's a commitment they're making. This is another way of looking at this. I don't think this is a specific nature of your problem or whatever, but I know people who've been reticent to accept other people's help. And you can think of somebody who's extremely, extremely depressed, for instance. If you get really depressed, you don't want somebody to help you. You don't want to be a burden on anybody. You want to be apart from everybody else. You just want to be unto yourself. And frankly, at some point, you often want to die. That's what happens to people. They don't want to be anything, any burden, any attachment. Yeah. The thing, and I've heard people give advice to people who are really depressed. The thing about other people who want to help the depressed person, they're making an investment. They love you. They want to do the thing for you. And it comes up in a weird way. And, the thing that you were talking about.
With the depression
not wanting
thing,
to hope.
sometimes, at least in my experience, it was more along the line. Well, I can only talk from my own experience on this stuff, right? It's this idea that the future is not necessarily going to be any better than it is now. A level of something better, right, goes away in that context. And if the future is not going to be better than what it is now, what is the point that I'm living for now? It's that stuff. Like, I remember after a transplant, and it's like you realize, you look up and you say, man, I've lost 10 years to just nothing.
Yeah.
Like, and there's nothing been accomplished. And you look at friends and everything else, and it's like those guys are graduated college, those guys are in careers. And there's this thing of like, all right, I went through my entire school succeeding. I did just succeeding. And now in this situation, it seems like I am failing or falling behind. It comes from this notion of like, it just seems like things are like either out of control, things are dark, and it's hard to kind of see how do you mind the gap, if that makes sense. It's those type of things. It's very dark. But I know what you mean. I get your point. It's like this notion of, all right, I want to be left to my own devices. I'm alienated in this situation. And it's like, how do you reach the person that is alienated in a situation? I don't think I'm that bad. I think I'm easy to get along with and talk to and stuff like
totally,
that.
Totally.
I may have ideas of people that may not entirely be true, even though I'm aware that those ideas may not entirely be true, if that makes sense. They kind of just exist simultaneously. But, it's what it is.
No. You don't seem to have that. I'll be honest. I've heard you talk about that kind of thing, but you're willing to ask for help. You seem like, you're
I don't have an issue. Yeah.
Same with me. I used to have that thing up the wazoo, and then I will admit traveling helped me a bit too. Hitchhiking, couch surfing, doing that kind of thing. Now there's an obligation, but it's anonymized a little bit. You don't know exactly who you're making the request of it with your thumb out. You don't know. You don't know the face of the person necessarily that you're going to stay with, which for some people is like, you're crazy for even doing it.
I'm not going to call you crazy. I do get the trust aspect. And look, when you're out the country, other countries are that way. I mean, Mark, for example, my wife and I were in, I think it was in Czech Republic. And the guy was like, hey, would you like a ride? The guy at the airport was like, hey, would you like to drive to your hotel? Seriously? Yeah, I don't mind. I'm about to get off work. Okay. Now, as Americans, this is like mind blowing to us. We don't even know if we should say yes to this. It was like, all right, we'll give you money. It's like, oh, whatever, man. Okay. And the guy drives us to the hotel. And when he says, he's like, look, I don't see anybody out there. Are you sure? I mean, you want me to wait? And we're like, dude, we can't impose upon you like this. And he's like, okay, well, look, here's my number if you need me, et cetera, et cetera. It was that. Like, it really, it's so weird when you're in other countries, man. And it really does set your context in regards to how you engage with other human beings.
Absolutely.
Mark, what did you take from that, Mark? I mean, I'm just curious. Like you say, you were basically self-improvement in the context of this trip. What did you leave? Like, if there was some kind of, I guess, larger contextual lesson from that travel or from that trip, especially since you seem to engage in that trip in somewhat of an introspective way. Meaning it wasn't just random. It was a there, and a reason, an intent behind doing it. It dealt with, on some level, self-improvement. What was the thing that you, after all of it, got out of it after the 2 months? If you had to kind of, summarize it and say, okay, this is the larger point. This is the thing that I think I got out of this experience.
I would sum it up to say people aren't that different. Yeah, they differ in their culture.
People are people everywhere you go. That's what I like to say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And for instance, probably the most magical moment I ever had in my life was this little village. It was called Lisvyanka, and it's on this beautiful lake called Lake Baikal in southern Russia. And I'm a drummer, right? And they were curious about me. And speaking about the language, the village, or whatever you call him, they used their kids who did speak English, or at least enough English to translate and for us to actually communicate. But you know how we actually bonded? And I changed my plans and stayed there a whole week. Drums. They were a musical place, a musical family. They had an old hand drum that I could play.
Mm-hmm.
It was wonderful. It wasn't fresh from Guitar Center. It was scratched and aged and weathered. And they had flutes, and they had instruments I'd never seen in my life. And I realized, wow, look what happens when you take a chance. Yeah, all my fears. I could have been beheaded or could have been held or all those moments like you were talking about in Jordan. I've been around there too. But they were curious, and in their culture, it's rude to have just some stranger roaming around, homeless, not knowing which, not reading the language. And in that part of the country, there's no English signs, none, And so people are people everywhere. I learned that in Indonesia, and it wasn't just Russia. I went from London to, of course, to France, to Poland, through the Czech Republic. Then I got on a train and went through Moscow. And the trip really began for me after I got out of Moscow, because I went all the way almost to the Pacific Ocean, or got close to it. And then we did a hard south through Mongolia. Mongolia was the same way. Then we went through China, not the tourist traps of China, but the places in China that they'd never seen an American in their life. And they'd say things like, "You're not like a normal American." And I'd like, "Well, how many Americans have you met?" And they'll be like, "Well, you're the first one." And they have the same biases, the same misplaced patriotism, the same weird psychological problems that Americans have. They just because it's relatively less poverty, they show it differently. But going back to that receiving love, my instinct was to because this happened over and over. This wasn't a one-off experience where somebody saw, oh, wow, he didn't have a hotel, or the train didn't come, and the little place here. So some people would give me a little, like what we would call a little barnyard apartment conversion, it had water and it had a little heater. Some people actually invited me right into their home. And it was just a magical experience, because those folks, I was thinking, do I offer them money? And one of this guy's daughter, in this sort of magical week I spent in Lisvyanka, said, "No, don't do that. That would be insulting. This is making them." I'm happy.
Broken for the positive, broken for the better. I've got an experience. I've talked about it briefly before. I thought I was going to get killed. I was hitchhiking from France into Switzerland, and a guy picked me up, or he didn't pick me up. He drove me down there from a grape harvest that I was doing in France, where I was sleeping, just at the side of railroad tracks every night, picking grapes, making like €100 a day or something. It was fantastic, delicious. We'd get driven out to the fields. I would walk because I had my little tent. Every night, didn't get that much sleep because I kept getting woken up by this train.
You have no idea how cool I think that is.
Well,
I would never do it, but
then,
I think that is so cool.
And so, yeah, and I couldn't speak with anybody else during the harvest because I spoke like the tiniest words of French. Anyway, had delicious lunches every day. I remember Tom cheese, all these different kinds of cheese, drinking wine out in the fields, passing around open bottles. It was a bunch of seniors. It was like a mix of retired seniors who did it for the tradition and the fun of it, and then young people who needed the money. And I was kind of in between in a weird way. Yeah. I was 19, not just age, but just my mentality about it. Anyway, I got a ride from a guy down into Switzerland there. He couldn't speak English. I couldn't speak French. We could not communicate. I thought he wanted to kill me at a certain point, just loomingly, because, we'd arrived in Geneva where I expected him to drop me off, and he wasn't dropping me off. Anyway, turns out his son owned a factory that he drove me out to. We showed up in the middle of the woods, far away from the city, at a factory. He asked me to wait in the RV. He went inside. Turned out it was a wafer factory, like an edible wafer factory that his son owned. Anyway, his son put me up. His son could speak English, put me up, acted as a translator between the two. Put me up for a couple of days. Son took me to the top of Mount Blanc. Was absolutely charitable and hospitable and one of the kindest people. Now, why did he do that? Because he had kids and he wanted to set a good example for them. He wanted to show them this is how you're supposed to treat somebody. This is the hospitality you're supposed to extend to a guest, to a foreigner, to a visitor, that kind of thing. And it is that humanity and the decency that you can't help but discover as soon as you push yourself out of your comfort zone and into humanity. And it is the weirdest thing that you can travel across the world, meet somebody, and get along with them better even than you would if you knew their language, just using sign language, hand to mouth communication and tiny words here or there, just little gestures. And the thing you're describing, where humans are humans, just who we are, humanity. You feel that you can get surprisingly on the same groove with somebody, even though they're 180 degrees in the other side of the circumference of this earth, and you have nothing in common with them according to culture or whatever. It's the craziest thing. Mark, fun conversation. Fun conversation. Good talking with you about it.
Absolutely. I mean, I wished more Americans traveled. When I was in Indonesia, what would embarrass me is I'd see Americans go to Indonesia, and there's this rich culinary just state of existence there. I mean, if you like tasty food, Indonesia is the place to go. And they want to go to McDonald's. I mean, it's embarrassing.
Yep.
Point where I'm like, okay, I don't claim these people. I don't know them. For them. Suck.
Wait a minute. To be fair,
I hear
for the
that.
defense of Americans going to McDonald's. Look, if you are traveling, look, I don't know. There's a situation. I'll speak for myself.
I never went to McDonald's.
You never went to McDonald's?
When I was
I've went to
one
McDonald's
time for the Wi-Fi, because I had to do some work and I needed the Wi-Fi. One time for the Wi-Fi.
So
That's
there was,
my plea.
there was Wi-Fi. There's that. But there's also, I was traveling. I think that was the first time out the country for a long, extended period of time. And I was craving home. Like it's like I needed a touchstone. Like it was like I just need something like home. And I think I felt like a KFC in like Egypt or somewhere.
But then they end up serving the weirdest food.
Yeah.
They serve like local variants of their food.
Yeah. And so it's like, look, sometimes you need that thing, right? That thing. But no, I feel you, Mark. Look, nobody wants to go to Indonesia and go to McDonald's. Ideally.
No.
Mark, thank you, man. Great conversation. Mark is an economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, capitalist, Schumpeterian, recovering libertarian, even though in no way he sounds like it. You can follow Mark on Twitter at Frosty Cash. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show by any means necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We have a great guest coming up. He has a book coming out on Venezuela, and I think he has a book coming out in 2 or 3 weeks, and being a friend of the show, I think it would be great to have a conversation on this very specific topic, especially since Wyatt, one of our correspondents, is also apparently there, and will be on to discuss tomorrow or the day after. We have Joe Imsberger. He is an engineer. uniformed member with Ecuadorian roots. You can find his writing on Telesur English, Venezuelan Analysis, and The Canary. Joe, welcome to the show, man. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, how are you today?
We're doing okay. Thank you for joining us on short notice. I appreciate you coming on. I was going to bring you on to have a conversation about something that you mentioned. We were talking about like the global south and stuff like that. But you mentioned that you had a book on Venezuela. And it's right here. I co-authored a book with Justin Podura about 20 years of propaganda against Venezuela, and it's going to come out in 2 to 3 weeks. Yeah. Let's start there.
Yeah, it's cool.
What's the name of the book? And it's the propaganda against Venezuela. Give us your thesis or your basic summation of the theme of the book.
Yeah, it's called Extraordinary Threat, the U.S. Empire, the Media, and 20 Years of Coup Attempts in Venezuela. So it basically goes over the record, the historical record of the last 20 years, as shown by corporate journalists and also the alternative media and various researchers. Basically, the available documentary record that we have, and shows that basically the United States is the extraordinary threat to Venezuela, not the other way around. Because the title comes from the fact that in 2015, Obama first imposed broad economic sanctions on Venezuela by declaring it officially in his executive order an extraordinary threat to the United States, to the national security of the United States.
Right. I remember that. And nobody asked him how. Nobody asked him how.
Pardon me?
Nobody asked him how. I mean, the operative question seems to be how. If Obama is going to argue that Venezuela is a national security threat, because I remember when he did this, and nobody said, well, wait a minute, how is Venezuela a national security threat to the United States? That question didn't seem to matter.
No, it either was ignored or sometimes it was just dismissed as, it's just because they realizing that it was absurd. We mentioned this in the book. Some articles, they tried to put out this defense of it, saying that it was just a formality. So, because in order to just basically avoid addressing the total insanity of it, they just said, well, it's just a formality, just something we do, as if it was just like, saying abracadabra or something, just meaningless words that you just say. But of course, it's not the case. I mean, when Trump tried to justify building his border wall by citing an extraordinary threat, I mean, there were legal challenges right away, and basically just the common sense legal challenges based on the fact that, well, just because you're the president doesn't mean you should be able to declare an extraordinary threat or national security threat just for any old reason. That's totally nonsense, and just to justify some policy you want.
Oh, that is what we do. That seems to be our modus operandi here. I want to come to this sort of specific news item in Venezuela. Looking forward to the book. That's cool to hear, Joe, and thank you for joining us. Also, but the bicentennial Congress of the peoples of the world, it's an event. President of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, is heading, as far as I can tell, taking place while we speak from June 21st to June 24th, the last couple of days, ending tomorrow. What is the point of this? Who is this between, and what is actually happening here? For outsiders, what's going on? Joe?
Well, I mean, the conference it's being attended by Evo Morales. I mean, I'm sure Wyatt will give you more details. I'm not there, and I can't give you too many details. I know it's celebrating the historic battle of Venezuelan independence, and it's important that they bring together international solidarity to try to push back against the sanctions, against there's really the United States has basically been at war with Venezuela since 2017, when what Trump did was he dramatically escalated the economic sanctions on Venezuela to the point where it's an all-out war. I mean, Venezuela is cut off from the U.S. financial system. It's subjected to, and then it was subjected to basically an oil embargo. And that now it's gotten to the point where the United States is outright stealing gasoline shipments.
Yes,
has stolen gasoline shipments to Venezuela. I mean, it's from Iran. So,
this is old hand, though, or is it? I mean, like you said, it's for the last 20 years, this kind of propaganda war against Venezuela. Do you consider this to be an escalation of that? I mean, meaning, yes, it seems that Trump jumped the shark on this, but however, like you made the point, Obama started this in 2015. And they tried to assassinate Hugo Chavez at one point also. So this even goes back on some level before Obama.
Oh yeah, definitely. It goes back all the way to the first time the U.S. backed opposition actually overthrew Chavez in 2002,
right?
April of 2002, and the Auditor General of the State Department actually concluded in a report that the United States had provided all kinds of support to people involved in the coup. Now, this is the Auditor General of the State Department, so they also added something to the effect, well, but this still isn't enough evidence to say that that the United States wanted the coup. But of course, that's just insane. Imagine if the United States government was overthrown for a few days, and the Russians said, "Yeah, of course we funded the people involved, but that doesn't mean we wanted the coup." I mean, no. I mean, this would be considered an act of war just there. I mean,
yeah, it's ludicrous on his face.
Well, nobody would accept. Yeah, no one would accept that. But basically, they were willing to concede. I mean, as far as the U.S. government, its officials, their mentality is that they just have the right to do this. They think they are entitled to govern the world. I mean, so they don't see any problem with funding groups and supporting groups that actually overthrew a democratically elected government in 2002 in Venezuela. And then they kept funding them. Yeah. And then shortly after that, they followed up with another attempt to oust the government in 2002. It spilled over into 2003, where they tried to shut down the oil industry. And so we in the book, we go through all these. There's 6 major efforts to overthrow the government in Venezuela, all backed by the U.S., all going back to 2002. So yeah, Trump escalated, though. Trump dramatically escalated because, unlike Obama, what he was doing was he was taking advantage of economic problems that arose from the fall in oil prices at the end of 2014, which hit the Venezuelan economy very hard. And they saw an opportunity then to really ramp up the pressure and kind of leverage that. And Trump just escalated even further. And he kept escalating even after 2017, 2019, recognizing Juan Guaido as the interim president.
Yeah.
That brought in more sanctions, more intense sanctions. So it just kept getting worse, and it just kept spiraling from there.
Over the last 20, 30 years, or the course of time that you were covering in the book, what has been the internal political effect of that pressure? If that makes sense. Like, because basically you have a superpower that has asserted the right to dictate who is in charge of your country, whether or not that country should be able to get oil revenue, and who should run that country, the politics of that country, meaning has asserted dominance for some God-given reason over another group of human beings that it has no God-given reason to be able to assert dominance over. And you can make an argument, I guess, that the dominance it's asserting is just the right of power, meaning power has the right to do X because power has the right to do X. There's no right, wrong, good, bad associated with it. It's just we have the capacity to do it, so we do it. It could be that blunt and simple. And there's advantages that we get out of it in the context, and we use the propaganda and everything else to kind of justify these kind of lewd and this horrendous actions. But what has been the internal political consequence of that? Meaning, like, how has, I guess, the political system dealt with that pressure being exerted on it over the last 20 years?
The Chavez government, when Chavez was in office, how he dealt with it was with an exceptional and really an extraordinary amount of tolerance. At the end of 2007, he granted a general amnesty to all the major participants in the first 2 coup attempts against him, who were still in Venezuela. Now, there were some exceptions for people convicted for, crimes of humanity, stuff like, major human rights abuse. But basically, he ended up giving an amnesty to people like Leopoldo Lopez, who's then went on to lead several other coup attempts. The same with Enrique Capriles, other major opposition figures. So they responded with a tremendous amount of tolerance for these coup attempts. And in exchange for that tolerance, they just get labeled a dictatorship that crushes dissent, which is just so preposterous. It's such an inversion of the truth. If anything, the critique of Chavez, especially with hindsight, it's important to note. It's always easy with hindsight to criticize, but the actual criticism, the more reasonable criticism, is that they should have come down much harder on the U.S.-backed seditionists all the way back in 2002. That they were too easy on them. They went too easy on them, and it probably was destructive at the end of the day. But it's a hard call to make because there's tactical considerations involved too. I mean, Juan Guaido,
right there,
not arrested.
Yeah, because you can't touch Juan Guaido. Juan Guaido, who is probably the safest man on the planet in Venezuela, at the very least during the Trump administration. I'm not quite sure about the Biden administration for obvious reasons. Like they have invested ridiculous amounts of, I don't know what you want to call it. They've pretended as if this man is president of a country that he's not, on some level that reviles him. Juan Guaido was willing to pay contractors, military contractors, to go through Venezuela, killing and kidnapping whoever needed to be in order to get and take power. Like, that gives you his take on Venezuelans, the country that he himself wants to rule. Like, that's astonishing that it takes place. And yet, nevertheless, it's there.
Right, and he's walking around free. Meanwhile, Evo Morales had to run for his life.
Right there.
When he was overthrown in a U.S.-backed coup in 2019. And then when the government of Luis Arce recently arrested the U.S. former U.S.-backed dictator of Bolivia, Jeanine Áñez, the
U.S. complained.
And the U.S. media, they all screamed. Like,
right, we're going to have to end this, Joe, but they complained because the U.S. media never accepted that it was a coup. That was the catch. Meaning the U.S. media, despite all of the obvious signs, despite all of the reality, the U.S. media would own up to it. Joe Emsberger, he's an engineer, uniform member with Ecuadorian roots. You can find his writing on Telesur English, Venezuela Analysis, and The Canary. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Back in a moment.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another hour, our last hour this morning of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, events, and more from across these disunited states of America and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan specifically. Without further ado, I want to get into the headlines. First up, in COVID news this morning. Actually, you know what? One last thing. I just hope everybody's having a great morning. I like to get that in there, and it's true. I like to get that in,
Hope everybody's having a great morning.
Just the well wishes. Because if you're a human being, gosh darn it, you're having a lot of experiences right now, and I hope they're good ones.
Well, I think it's a good way to start off a day. Hey, I hope you guys are having a good morning.
Yeah.
Let's do the news.
It's
that type of stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. And with that, let's do the news. In the headlines, first up in COVID news, about 12,773 new COVID cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Also, there were about 432 new deaths over the past week. There have been an average of about 11,370 cases per day. That's a decrease of 21% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 45% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated at this point, and 53% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected about 33,537,000 people across the United States and killed 602,164 people across this country. The United States is also expected not to hit the 70% adult vaccination rate by July 4th. Those rates that I gave a minute ago, those were for all American residents, including kids and the elderly, all that. 45% total vaccinated, fully 53% at least partly vaccinated. Anyway, that's 65% of American adults at least partly vaccinated. Those are of all adults. That is, while that may seem close to the 70% threshold, that's only like 2 weeks away at this point, and we are just not set to hit that. In fact, it's less than that, 12 days, I believe. We're not set to hit the 70% mark. Biden promised it. We've already gotten decently vaccinated at this point. We're doing pretty well in my book. Could have done it earlier, could have done it faster, whatever. There's certainly more to get. But at a certain point, what you hit, Jamarl, when the rubber meets the road,
by the way,
you need to convince all the anti-vaxxers that there's not so scary, I guess.
That.
And I don't know how you do that. And I don't really want the government even trying to do that because I don't like the government trying to convince people of things. Hopefully people come to it of their own accord.
No. I'm okay with the government trying to convince people of things. I don't want the government lying.
Yeah.
But there are things like, because look, to me, and anywhere you go is where you're at with the propaganda stuff. It's like there are going to be things that, and I get it, right? You don't want the government being this kind of totalitarian thing which trying to impose its will upon the population, that type of stuff.
The concern is that you get people who are resistant to anything the government says to them, which I do not want to be the case. I simply want the government to say things when it needs to say them, for us to have good reason to trust it, and to kind of trust us to figure out it, out for
that, the government needs to be trusted.
Yeah.
And the government needs to have a track record of trust in order to make that work.
Yeah.
And if the government did have a track record of trust, you wouldn't have this, like, we're concerned with Alex Jones, so we're getting rid of Alex Jones. That wouldn't exist. That wouldn't exist.
We distrust the government because we are correctly convinced that the government is in the business of convincing us of things, many of which aren't true.
Yes.
So we're suspicious because we're like, you guys are trying to play with our minds. Screw you.
Yeah.
I'm going to play with my own mind.
Yeah.
Thank you
guys
very
have
much.
Political ambitions that may go beyond my own wants, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But there are things that, our society may try to get across to people that may be beneficial. I think the racial stuff, meaning civil rights, going back trying to say, all right, we need you to be less racist. How do we do this? That stuff. And if that is true, and if you agree with that, then it sets the precedent, if that makes sense. Meaning it sets the precedent that there is something that a larger body, whatever you want to call it, larger body. Let's say it's not even the U.S. government. Let's say far in future time, all of this collapses, all of this reforms. You have a government that people say, we believe that government is telling the truth, more or less, as people. And the government has certain perspectives will say, hey, look, based on our point of view, this is the way we need to go.
Yeah.
Now, you can disagree with it, everything else, but all things being equal, if you don't have this government that you believe is just being, deceptive, then you kind of want that.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. The issue is the prior issue of lying. It's that.
Yes.
I mean, because it becomes everything is difficult to believe it at that point.
Of course. And it reminds me of, the phrase, the beatings will continue until morale improves.
Right.
It's like the propaganda will continue until fake news improves, until disinformation improves, whatever.
Until you guys stop doing that. We'll keep the propaganda.
Yeah, but I get it. They're not actually the same thing. And it maybe in some universe, the beatings actually do help morale because maybe only certain people deserve to be beaten. And they get it, and everybody else is satisfied and watches, as they get pilloried or whatever. But most likely what seems to happen is you just make people more depressed and upset. And usually when you propagandize them more, even if your propaganda is technically accurate, people just distrust you, and they just are driven further into whatever corner they're currently comfortably residing in.
What if Biden came out and says, you know what? I've had a come to Jesus moment. And he comes out and says, I am going to function on good, honest government from here on out. And goes with that.
As opposed to what?
Right. I guess, as opposed to now. Right is all the things that he's promised. Has he done them? No. And so it's like, is that a lie? Or was that him saying things in order to get elected? Yeah, I think it's him saying things to get elected. That's a lie.
But that's his job.
His job is to lie to get elected?
Yeah.
No, that's not his job.
Oh, that's his job.
That is not his job.
The job of every organism is to stay alive. And who are we to say that a politician's job is not to remain a politician?
That may be fair, but his job is not to lie. That's a different thing.
Oh, yes, it is.
No, it's not.
Oh, yes, it
his
is.
job is not to lie.
It's to
his
keep us
job
calmly asleep.
Look, you can make a case, let's say from the standpoint of a philosophical job description of the President of the United States. What is his role? And what is his role under the notion of the Constitution, under this notion of this idea of America and everything else? And I don't believe for one moment that dishonesty is the job description of the President of the United States.
People go out and pay drug dealers to buy drugs. We go into the ballot box, we vote our presidents into office, and we expect him to keep us opiated. We expect him, like Karl Marx said about religion, serving up the opiate of the masses or whatever. Right. We expect the president to keep us mostly comfortable with the state of affairs as it currently exists. That's the fact of the matter, in my opinion. When we go in to vote a president into place, we don't have any expectation that they're going to really change things. Do we really have that? I mean, maybe.
You think people have an expectation when they go into the ballot box, this guy's going to totally lie to me constantly?
Yeah.
I don't think that at all.
No,
I don't buy that.
Without being conscious of it. No, I'm just taking out a controversial position.
Yeah, I don't buy that at all.
Some point,
I think when people go in, I think they get radically disillusioned. And the reason they get disillusioned is because in the beginning, they had beliefs. This guy's going to do this. This guy's going to do that. Didn't do any of those things.
But if we're willing to abandon our senses so readily, can we really say that we have them? If we're willing to abandon our beliefs every couple of years, if we're that much of a goldfish, are we really there at all? Are we really conscious even? You get my point in some sense. Can we even say that we're political actors if we're just used and manipulated and brought up again and again to get the right person into office? Are we tools or are we people?
We're tools.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of
That's
both.
the sad truth of it. What do you do with that?
It kind of depends on the perspective, right?
How do you go with that?
If you are in a political space and you need to get elected, those people are tools.
Yeah.
Me and Sunan. If you are a person who wants to get things accomplished, you're a person who wants to get things accomplished, or using a political instrument as a tool. Meaning, to me, Sanders is a tool, no more, no less.
Yeah.
He is my tool to get things done. He's a horse that I'm riding to try to get these things accomplished, no more, no less. And, from the standpoint of politicians, I suppose they look at this the same way. Look, I don't know how to get more ethical and honest political system from where we are. It's almost like putting together a Rubik's Cube almost. And, especially when the incentives go against that. They go against it. So, I don't know. I have no idea. But I don't think that people believe their politicians lie. In fact, I would go further than that.
Are you kidding me? We know that politicians lie.
We know that they lie, but I don't think their job is to lie. I've met people who are so radically, what's the word I'm looking for? Naive. That there was a guy that I used to work with, and the guy says something like, he says, my neighbor got caught with pot. He said, this was like maybe 5 or 6 years ago. He says, my neighbor got caught with pot. He says, and his kid apparently turned him in. He says, I thought that was a good guy. And I said, what? What?
Oh, what?
Because he was using pot? Yes, it's against the law. That guy exists. Like, that's the point I'm making. That guy is all throughout the United States. We don't know who that guy is because we don't talk to that guy, right? That's not our sandbox.
Yeah.
That guy has a huge sandbox.
Yeah.
That guy is functioning and bumping heads and thinking to himself, people using pot, they're criminals.
Yeah.
Despite the fact he might be alcoholic, right? I think so. I can't. It's hard for me to look at my political distribution and the people who I deal with politically and say, okay, this is the world. I don't think that's the world at all. I think that guy's the world.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate.
I hear you. And where do you, the mind reels from it on some level.
I'm shocked.
I have a dark sense of humor, and you can tell that because that's the first real belly laugh that you've elicited from me throughout the show. It's the most screwed up thing you brought up this morning. It's a kid reporting on his parent
kid turning his dad in
because he smokes weed.
Does he smoke
It's
weed?
turning into the Gestapo.
And the other guy is
madness.
Can't believe he did that. And he's really angry, saying that was a horrible
siding
person.
with the kid.
Yeah,
exactly.
like there's a moral failing associated with it.
I hear you. No, I don't.
Weirdo.
No,
God,
exactly.
That was a weirdo.
And where do you go with that? Are we goldfish or are we men? I don't know. I feel like we're goldfish.
I guess goldfish.
Because at a certain point, okay, the Iran Contra crisis will continue until the drug war improves. Like at some point, it doesn't make any sense. Our own intelligence community does this stuff.
Yeah,
you get my point.
But he doesn't know that. He doesn't know that. That's the part, right? That's the aggravating part. He doesn't have that.
Maybe.
The background knowledge.
But if you ask him, do you know about the Iran-Contra crisis? He might not know it, or he might know it, and it might just be shelved away. I think that's how this stuff works.
Oh, man.
Coming from very, 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 very far afield, there's this theory in psychology. I'll put it like this. Do you feel like you are the same person you've always been, or do you feel like there are multiple people inside you sort of talking at each other? Multiple people. Because there's internal family systems is this theory in therapy or psychology. Basically, people have voices of their families. You have your inside sort of role model.
Yeah.
This is what my dad would say. This is what my mom would say. You got these voices talking inside you, and it's not schizophrenia. It's just what it means to be a human.
Right.
You got these different influences in you, and you should reconcile them. Try to work it out. You know what? One thing I realized we have not yet closed headlines.
Oh, the music running in the background. Have it.
Yes. Let's close headlines out. Those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Which one is it? You got multiple people running in your head, or just you've incorporated all of them?
I don't know, but what it has to do with one thing that might make the difference here is people's sense of themselves across time. I'll put it like this: Do you feel throughout the course of your life that you've always been one person, or have you been different people at different points? Like you've changed enough for you to be different people?
No, the kernel of code that was there in the very beginning is still there.
Still there. It's the same person.
It may be, you've added different values to the equation.
Yeah.
So X has a different value, Y has a different value, Z has a different value, but the equation is still the equation. That's
because and coming back to the topic, it relates. maybe if you feel like you're a different person across time, then it would match up that you feel like you have different people inside you that are talking to you. You've got these different modes that you can switch into where you suddenly remember things. Like if I get angry, maybe I'm reminded of some things that suddenly come to light, that change how I think, that change what I'm remembering at the time, that change fundamentally who I am at that moment. And then, we can sort of subconsciously or unconsciously switch between different modes. And anyway, bringing it back to politics, people can know things without knowing that they know them until they're immediately reminded of them. People can know of the Iran-Contra affair, can know that this long suppressed story that the CIA, drugs, guns for drugs, selling guns, getting cocaine. They can be reminded of this and suddenly brought back into enlightenment. But most of the time, we just forget about it. And the same person who was commending the kid for reporting his dad for smoking weed can be reminded of it and be like, wait, cognitive dissonance, let me think about this. But for the most part, we're goldfish. We just forget about what's inconvenient to us to remember.
I don't know, man. I mean, maybe, yes, clearly, on some level, yes.
Yeah.
Right? You can't take away from that. That guy was just in the dark. Like, I'll give you another case. I was watching television with this woman. I think we were at the clinic. And North Korea comes up. And they're talking about Kim Jong-un and everything else on the television. And a woman looks at me, she says, that guy's nuts. And she's like, that guy, he's just throwing missiles and this and that.
Yeah.
And I said, do you know why he's doing that? And she says, oh, no. Well, shouldn't that matter to you? Like, is it possible that he's not just nuts? Like, maybe there's a reason and rationale for it. I said, did you know, maybe you didn't know this, that we are doing missile tests or testing as if we're going to invade the country? Did you know that? No, I didn't know that. He keeps saying stop. We keep doing it. He doesn't like it. They do that. The media doesn't show you the other part. Did you know that when we were in the war, the Forgotten War, they call it the Forgotten War because I'm sure you forgot it, that we killed a fifth of their population.
The Korean War?
Yeah.
Give it a name?
Yeah, Forgotten War. That's what it's called, Forgotten War.
No, totally.
Yeah. Oh, my bad. My bad. I was saying Forgotten War because I'm making a point that
totally.
But
wait,
yeah.
What war was it again?
Right. And so it's like, I was like the fifth of their population. I was like, we've forgotten that. They haven't. And that stuff is entrenched in the cultural thing every bit as much as race is to you. And she's like, okay. I was like, the point that I'm trying to make to you is you're saying that guy is nuts. And yet, regardless of whatever proclivities that guy has that may be, totalitarian and everything else, it doesn't mean he's not a rational actor. And this notion of dropping context and acting as if he's just insane makes it far easier for you to deal with him on that because you don't have to deal with him as a real person.
Yeah.
And, those are the people who we deal with constantly, right? She doesn't know that. She doesn't know any of that. And yet, she has a fully formed opinion. She's very clear in her perspective on this stuff. My mom, Vladimir Putin, my mom's, he's a horrible guy. Years ago, right? And I'm like, why do you think that? She doesn't know him from whole at all. And it's like you get this stuff that soaks into you over time, that you just absorb, and it comes out at various particular moments where you don't even know that you absorbed. And so when you're talking to people like that, and she's like, yeah, that guy's nuts. I love those conversations. I always enjoy those conversations. I engage people with those conversations all the time. Another guy in the clinic, hey, what's up with China? Let's have that talk. And afterwards, like, dude, how do I extricate myself from this conversation? Well, you said it, you put it up. I'm just having a conversation with them, but stuff that you talk.
At a certain point, they're reticent.
Hates me when
I hear you. Well, but those can be valuable conversations to have, particularly if you're having them in public and you can, educate people on a sort of mass basis.
And by the way, no negative intent with that, like no aggressiveness, anything. Like
totally.
Me, I am glowing having those conversations.
The problem with it is usually people don't have they have lightly formed beliefs based on insufficient information, which is all they need to act on because they don't ever act on it. It's not personally relevant to her except as a looming emotion, whether or not North Korea is a threat or Vladimir Putin's a threat. It only becomes more relevant when it gets activated as a casus belli for a declaration of war or something like that. For most people, they go on what they need to go on, which is not much, which is sad because for you entering into that conversation, it's fairly easy to actually change somebody's views. They have less information than you do. You can bring new facts to the conversation. And therefore, theoretically, in some world, you can convince them. But people don't know what they don't know.
And often don't get convinced.
At a certain point, we're disincentivized. They're rational actors too, just like Kim Jong-un in this conversation. They don't have the incentive to like, okay, I'm going to spend this time updating my beliefs on this thing. Right. And not only do we not know what we don't know, we're by definition, practically, we're not aware of the biases that keep us from knowing the things or noticing the things that we don't know. Anyway, we've got to go to a break here. Weirdly on point, even though we're moving to another topic with our next guest, Robin Hanson, author And I'll get into his bio. But I think of author specifically because he's author of the book Elephants in the Brain, which is about biases and detecting biases in human behavior and your own behavior. Interesting topic. We'll probably only hit it peripherally before we get onto aliens, which is what we're planning on talking about with him. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, coming back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're talking with Robin Hanson, Associate Professor of Economics at George Mason University, also a futurist and an author. Now, Robin, last time we spoke with you, we had you on to talk about your book, The Age of M. The Age of Emulation is what M stands for in this case. We're talking about simulated human minds running on computers and what kind of society would result from the advent of this new technology. And that's, extended sociological and economic analysis. You're bringing sort of more economic angle, but, public choice theory, other analyses of rational actors, how they behave, kind of gives you a lens for analyzing that. And it was a fascinating conversation, fascinating book, but it's one of just many that I know you would be considered an expert on. And I consider you an expert on, to be clear. Now, let's get to aliens here. Could talk about biases, could talk about the elephant in the brain. The book you wrote with, I believe it was Kevin Simler of Melting Asphalt, also a good blog I recommend. Anyway, let's talk about aliens here. You have this website, grabbyaliens.com. Jamarl Thomas, my co-host, big, longtime fan of aliens. And Robin Hanson, you also you invented the term, the concept, popularized at the very least, a great filter, which applied to aliens fitting in with the Fermi paradox, basically is the idea. Potentially there is something that is universally keeping aliens civilizations, extraterrestrial civilizations effectively, from coming to prominence, from spreading, and frankly, from us being able to see them. And just stipulating that idea has given people a language and a concept, a handle for talking about something that it should in some sense boggle all of our minds. Why are there not more of us in a cosmic sense? Why do we not see other examples in this vast space? Anyway, you have a model addressing this idea, talking about different types of aliens. I'll start it off here. Robin, what is your model, and how would you sort of frame it? How would you characterize it? For people who are skeptical of the existence of aliens but are watching these disclosures, what is this idea that you're putting forward? How seriously should people take it? What sort of lens should they adopt to look at it? It is a model, and what does that mean epistemologically in terms of the confidence people should place in it? How do you see it, Robin?
That's a lot of questions.
It is.
But let's try. All right, so we're here, and we hope or even think there's a chance that we may become much bigger in the near future, in say 1 million years. We could not only fill the solar system, but expand out and fill our galaxy. So we see this potential for ourselves in a short cosmological time. And this future version of ourselves seems like it would be visible from a long way. We wouldn't just go out there and pass by and, put a little flag on things. We would stop and take things apart and rearrange them and make them into something different and more useful to ourselves. That's what we do here on Earth when we colonize and domesticate and use things, right? So the model is to say that happens sometimes. That's the key thing. Sometimes there will be a civilization that arises, life evolves, life advances, something like us appears, then we go on to become something more advanced that then expands and moves out and changes things and becomes visible. So our model just has 3 parameters that describe this process. It says, these things appear at a certain rate, and there's a overall rate and a power law for the rate, and then they expand at some speed, and there's just these 3 parameters in the model. And in some sense, you'd say, well, that's just a general description of the universe is that these things appear at some rate and expand. Now, you might say, well, what if they appear so rarely that even in our entire visible universe, we're the only one? That's a possible version of the model I just described, and in which case, then we'll just never see anything else, right? We will just maybe someday expand, and if we don't and we die, our universe will just stay empty from where we can see. So we say that model doesn't fit our data because we are early. So we humans today have appeared at almost 14 billion years, but the universe will go on for many, many trillions of years. The average star lasts for 5 trillion years. And so we're really early. And our explanation for why we are early is to say, well, this process by which advanced life appears and then expands is happening at a rate such that the universe will get filled up with these things relatively soon, say in a few billion years, after which we could no longer appear because there wouldn't be a place for us. And that's the explanation for why we're as early as we are. And so the story is this model is applying to us now, and the parameters are such that within a few billion years, the universe will just be filled up with these.
But we're so early.
Even more fundamentally, there's 3 parameters here, and we can estimate all the 3 parameters from data. That's the key claim. This isn't just a hypothetical. It's a model that is the best fit to the data we see in the universe, not only our earliness, but 3 other key things we see that we can fit to this model. Sorry.
Explain for the moment our earliness. I don't understand that. So you're saying that we are early because we are early? That we are, because if it was later on in the process, the space will be filled up despite it being infinite. And within the context of that space being filled up, it will be less likely for us to come about. I'm trying to understand the logic.
We can only appear in an empty, dead universe. Our planet has sat here unused for billions of years. It allowed life to appear and then slowly develop on Earth because it wasn't being used for other things. If there had been an advanced civilization here 2 billion years ago, they would have taken the Earth apart and built whatever else they wanted out of it. And then we couldn't have evolved here.
And to
we can
radically
only appear in places that are dead and empty.
If I radically simplified things, just using your 5 trillion year star lifespan here as a sort of natural timeline. Again, I'm not saying to take this model seriously, but as a sort of lighted children, a pedagogical thing, that kind of thing. Say you were to count to 100, and there's some event that you're waiting for that you know is going to happen, possibly many times throughout the 100 seconds that you're counting.
Right.
But there's a sort of like a timer building up or something, and you're going to see this event happen as you're counting to 100. When would you expect it to happen? Now, this is a rhetorical question, but in this model, you're saying, we appeared 14 billion years into this process. If it's 5 trillion years, that's less than 1/100th of the span of the way through this series of events. In other words, the event that we are ourselves a witness to, the origin, and spread and apparent success so far of life on Earth, that is like a fraction of a second into that long 100-second count, which is itself a kind of evidence. And isn't this related to the anthropic argument or anthropic evidence?
But it's much worse than you've just described. You've just described a process where we have a uniform chance of appearing at any point in this window when the planet is available. But in fact, we believe that the life appears as a power law of, say, to the power 6. And that raises this 1% to the power 6. It means not only are we 1% earlier, we're 1% to the power 6 earlier, 10 to the minus 12 early.
Well, I guess the early thing is throwing me. I understand what you mean. It's the universe will go on for a very, very long period of time as far as we know it. And we are showing up in this context where within trillions of years, potentially, more, beings are going to fill up the universe and everything else. I get that. I guess my thought is life seems to grow anywhere. I mean, like you have volcanic pits or, outside of the space shuttle or stuff like that.
On Earth, life seems to grow most everywhere. And yes, the universe around us is dead and empty. So that's the great puzzle of, say, the Fermi paradox. And the great filter is just another way of expressing the puzzle that it seems like life could start most anywhere, and yet we see it almost nowhere. So there must be a huge obstacles between simple dead matter and eventually becoming something visible. That's the idea of the great filter. And there must be some parameters are. And 20 years ago when I wrote about the great filter, it was just saying this general thing. And here in the Gravity Aliens model, we have more precise numerical estimates for the key parameters.
And under the maybe it would be worthwhile or helpful to explain the great filter model more generally. I'll leave that up to you, Robin. I'll be brief here. Under your gravity aliens model, do you need a great filter, or does it sort of explain time wise? Okay, it makes sense. We're fairly early. That fits the narrative here. We will likely spread unless we fail. Right. Is there a great filter? Is that necessary under your new model? How prevalent do you expect it to be? And would that explain the silent
is telling you the
aliens?
Size of the great filter? The great filter argument just says in general it's a huge number, but we can't be very sure how big a number it is. The gravity aliens model tells you just how big it is. So, for example, we estimate roughly that, in a middle estimate of our gravity aliens model, each gravity alien civilization will come to occupy 10 million galaxies. That's the typical spacing between them. So, they each appear somewhere and they expand, and then they stop expanding when they reach another gravity alien civilization. And at that point, they typically encompass 10 million galaxies. That's a long way away. That means, the average distance between them is that far away, which is a huge filter, right? It says that even in, 15 billion years, on average, only one such thing appears every million galaxies. So our gravity aliens model is saying, not only is there a great filter, it's giving a number to it. It's saying how big it is.
And it doesn't necessarily stipulate the nature of that great filter. So, for instance, I've brought up a couple of times now, the estivation hypothesis, I believe, is the name and how it's pronounced, which I think Andrew Sandberg came up with this.
Yes,
exactly.
It's a colleague of mine.
Thank you. Okay. I thought there might be a connection there, but just briefly, the idea that as the heat death of the universe occurs, as space cools effectively, as matter drifts further and further apart, you're gonna have some aliens who effectively go into a hibernation mode in order to use the naturally cool universe at the sort of end of time, you can think of it maybe, in order to run, coming back to your idea about EMS, simulated versions of themselves or civilizations in order to have the most computing efficiency, because cooling a computer is sort of the most expensive part of it in some sense. Is that broadly a brief?
I'm a co-author of a critique of Sandberg's paper. So his basic idea is that, instead of you go out and expand, and instead of doing stuff now, you would just lock down and wait for a distant future and then do stuff then when you could. In which case you wouldn't see much now, which might be an explanation for why everything looks invisible. Now, I think they've just misdone the entropy calculation. There isn't a reason to wait. That is, once you have some neg entropy now, you might as well use it because it's not that much more valuable later. So that would be our response. I have several co-authors in a response to that argument. But there are a number of people who try to come up with creative theories about how the aliens could be out there all over the place and yet not be visible. So, for example, there's the zoo hypothesis that they are, putting some shield around us to make it look like the universe is empty, but it's really full and we're all being fooled. Or there's this berserker hypothesis that everybody's out there but hiding from each other because if anybody sticks their head up, they get shot down. And because people have been really puzzled by this idea that the universe looks empty. You say, well, things like us doesn't look that hard, and here we are, but this universe is empty, and people do struggle to come up with a story to explain that.
People do struggle to come up with a story to explain it. Scientific America basically said, hey, maybe the aliens are already here. So what if people are just looking too hard? What if that all sorts of propaganda have taken place over the last 60, 70, how many ever years that says, oh, this is conspiracy theory. We're alone in the universe. There's nothing here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And anything that you guys will see, be it Foo Fighters, be it weird phenomena in the sky and everything else, swamp gas. Now, you've had scientists who said this is nonsense. Hynek, for example, Jay Hynek, who studied this stuff. You've had people recently within the U.S. government pointing out, saying, hey, this stuff doesn't necessarily look like us. And look, while it could be us, I accept that. There is this question now on whether it is. And the catch is this notion of, well, there's nothing out there. And SETI has just been looking forever. Maybe they're wrong. Maybe it's closer than what we think. And whatever, this notion of looking in the universe and everything else, I don't know. But I would say this. There are certain questions that scientists are going to have to ask coming up or answer coming up recently in regards to information that is being released coming from either government sources, coming from military sources, the Pentagon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. the Scientific America's paper about maybe they're already
I'm very
here.
sympathetic to UFOs as aliens.
Well, even if they're not aliens.
My grabby aliens model isn't a model of that scenario, but I can easily come up with variations that could make more sense of UFOs being aliens. So I think it's a completely reasonable open questions and shouldn't be dismissed out of hand at all.
Well, the Scientific America one is very interesting because they make the argument that, look, these are likely robots if they're anything. Meaning, let's say for the moment that you guys,
that's wrong.
Right. Well, their thing is, well, maybe they're robots from dead civilizations. No. But how's that different than grabby aliens?
Any advanced civilization is going to be robots. I'm sorry. Squishy biological things like us just don't have a future. In our future, within 1 million years, all of our descendants will be robots.
Well, we don't know that.
They will. That's just naturally the way it will be. So any aliens who come here will be robots. They don't need to send robots.
For you to know that.
This is where it could get controversial.
It's impossible for you to know that.
Robin,
don't
make
get me
your
wrong.
case.
Look, because here's the thing. You may have people who say, I don't want to give up my humanity in this process.
But don't they just get out-competed?
Maybe. I mean, but it depends on how far it goes, right? I mean, you may have a situation where, for example, when you say, man, robots, are they just augmented? Like transhumanism is a little bit different than a person turning into a robot or a person living in a simulation, if that makes sense. Meaning, if I get a brain chip that allows me to think faster in order to keep up with a computer that is, insane, am I a robot at that point? Or have I just been altered? And is there a difference in those things? I think there is a difference in those things. I think there is something about retaining humanity while augmenting humanity at the same time. I don't necessarily think that's a transition over into a robot. I could be wrong.
And again, it's perfectly reasonable on a time scale of 100 or 1,000 years to think we'll drag our feet and we'll say, no, we don't like that. We're talking millions of years or even billions of years here. The key thing about cosmology is you're talking really long time scales. So you have to ask, not how much does culture change in my lifetime or something like that. You have to ask about a really long time. And if we look at our time scales in the past, the animals that gave rise to us have changed enormously.
That's true.
In billions of years or even millions of years. Absolutely enormously. Humans have changed enormously in just 10,000 years.
Okay, you know what? This actually
if we're talking about like thousands of, okay, fair enough. Because at that point it becomes so radically
you're talking not just
out there.
Those are geological timescales, and those aren't even getting into the astronomical timescales that had been the site of our conversation.
It doesn't touch it. Yeah.
We went to millions of years just now, but we were talking about trillions of years a few minutes before, and at a certain point, the mind boggles at it all. The sense of scale breaks down completely. Yeah. But Robin, this is that kind of thought process. Just almost methodologically or something like that. We brought up Anders Sandberg. There's also Nick Bostrom. The idea of anthropic evidence. There's some thinkers around the fact that we experience ourselves experiencing ourselves, that we're born into this universe in exactly the way that it's cited. Whether or not we can take our own existence as evidence, that idea is itself interesting. Then there's another topic, which is, it's also quite interesting. Anybody who gets into future studies or futurism, whatever term you want to use for it, futurism or futurology, are, I think, interchangeable effectively. You start to deal with events, orders of magnitude into the future, populations of people or agents, orders of magnitude more than we're familiar with. And it becomes, many differences that each make differences. We get sort of, it becomes very hard to think about, to put it quite simply. How is that thought process, thinking in terms of extremely large scales, extremely far into the future, is that disorienting? Does it magnetize your compass in a weird way? Does it change how I think you might understand where I'm going. Does it change how you evaluate things?
It's exciting and empowering, but also very dangerous.
Yeah.
So most people, you look at one new possibility or two new possibilities, and you say that's mind expanding. And then you notice, like you just did, there's 20 more mind expanding possibilities we could consider. Then you try to throw them in the bucket all at once. And then, you basically blanch. You say, I can't do this. And so the usual reaction is just to put them all in the same bucket and back off and say, I'm not going to think about any of those things. That's all just too hard. And I'm going to stay in my conventional world. And the problem is you put lots of things in the bucket, but they don't all deserve to be in the same bucket. Mm-hmm. Every once in a while, we find a thing that we say, we threw it into this wild possibilities bucket, but it's actually like a lot more possible than the rest.
Give me an example.
That's the art of noticing when something should be given a lot more serious attention and not just treated as another wild thing that goes into the wild thing bucket. And I think that's happening with UFOs at the moment in terms of the culture. It had been thrown in with ghosts and, wild creatures of the sea and everything else as just another weird wild things people talk about. And now people are pulling it out and saying, well, what if we thought this was actually more realistic or serious than the rest? What if we took this one seriously? What happens then? And that's the kind of thing you need to do sometimes.
Yeah,
you can't just throw everything in the well bucket. You have to be selective and say which things have this, strong, solid evidence in their favor, and you want to be careful in thinking those things through.
I'm curious. What are your thoughts? The report is supposed to come up, I guess, Friday. The U.S. government is putting out their UFO report. You have the site, Grabby Aliens. The report is not going to say they're aliens, nothing like that.
No.
They're basically saying we don't know, and the report is basically leaving a question mark on all of it. We think it might be Russia, China, and no way is it our secret tech. No way is secret tech.
Maybe. I think the answer is they're not going to say.
No, they're not. But what do you think about it? What do you think about? Real quick, what do you think about just all of it? Like this notion that, like you say, this has been one of those things that they've pulled out of the bucket in many respects. I mean, the Pentagon comes out and basically say, here are the videos. You have all of these people back in here. How do you frame that? I mean, you have just like Grabby Aliens. You've been talking about this in the abstract, in the sense of like the filter and everything else, and giving the mechanics and somewhat of equations in order to try to explain what does this look like in practice. Just kind of a model for life in the universe as the universe expands and grows. How do you consider this? How do you frame all this? I mean, this is somewhat fascinating to me.
So there's two parts of it. One is the actual concrete evidence and how persuasive it is.
Right.
And I'm not an expert on that, but it looks pretty persuasive. I got to say, it looks pretty real. And it looks like something that nobody on Earth could do. But I think what a lot of sort of scientist types say, they say, sure, it looks pretty real, but my prior expectation that this could be real is just crazy low. There's just no way this makes any sense, they say to themselves. Therefore, it just can't be real, right? I mean, if you have a wild dream that felt really real, you say to yourself, yeah, but that couldn't be real, and you walk away, right? So my contribution here is to say, well, no, it's not that crazy unlikely, okay? If I say, what's our best theory that could explain this if UFOs really were aliens, I can come up with a story that is only a little bit crazy. It's got a few parts that you might think are a little unlikely, but they're not that unlikely. So it's like in a legal trial for attempted murder, right? You've got somebody accused of attempted murder. If you think about the prior ahead of time, you say, well, what fraction of people are ever murdered? Maybe 1 in 1,000. How many friends would they have that might want to murder their associates? Well, another 1 in 1,000. And you end up with a prior that's really low. You say, well, the prior odds of this hypothesis, somebody says that A murdered B, are really low, but you're still willing to consider the evidence because, hey, it might happen. And I think that's the sort of thing happening here. Your prior expectation might be a bit low, but I'd say only maybe 1 in 1,000 or higher than 1 in 1,000, that this isn't that crazy a story. And you got to look at the evidence and say, look, how clear is it? And I'd say it actually looks pretty good.
Well, and okay, so maybe we do have enough time. Actually, I'll throw in the term the term Bayesian epistemology here, and we can talk about elephant in the brain. Not obviously, you know what that is, Robin. Bayesian epistemology.
Sure,
you can probably explain it better than I can. But effectively, how would you relate that to aliens, and how would you relate your book, Elephant in the Brain, with Kevin Simler, a conversation about biases, about undetected, things steering our behavior. In this case, the elephant, the sort of hidden underbelly. What is Bayesianism? How does it affect what level of credence people should give to claims about UFOs? And how does that relate to how we detect biases in general? Robin.
Right. So the key idea of Bayesianism is to separate sort of the evidence from your prior expectations. So just like in a murder trial, as I said, the prior expectation that any one person murdered any one other person is pretty low, but not zero. But then you saw somebody testify, they saw A, yelling at B, or A went out and bought a gun and B was killed by a gun. And, each of those pieces of evidence, you ask yourself, well, under this hypothesis that A killed B, how likely would we think this piece of evidence is? If A actually killed B, would they buy a gun? Would they yell at them? And each piece of evidence, we say, well, yeah, under this hypothesis that A murdered B, this piece of evidence would have been more likely. That would have been more likely to happen under that scenario. And if you add enough of those pieces of evidence together, they can overcome this unlikely prior, where before the murder trial, you would have said, what do you think the chance is that A would have murdered B? You go, well, that's pretty crazy unlikely, 1 in a million, right? And so that's the kind of thing we need to do with UFOs. We have to say, okay, what are the different hypotheses? So, the 4 categories are, some sort of delusion, drunk, LSD, sleep, thinking they were awake when they were asleep, things like that, just errors and delusions. Second category is a hoax. somebody has just paid a bunch of people to lie about these things, doctored photos, made up video evidence, etc., all in some campaign to fool somebody. The third category is it's some power that's really has these things and doing it, but it's around here, a secret government lab, some foreign government, military. And the fourth category, it's real and it's doing these things, but it's not from around here, i.e. aliens. So for each of these categories, you start right ahead and say, had I not seen any of this evidence, what would be my prior expectation? How often does anybody make a mistake like this and are deluded into thinking they saw a thing like this? How many dreams look like this? Secondly, how often does anybody try to fool someone this way? Put together a big hoax over 70 years across, dozens of countries. And third, you say, well, what's the chance that some other country really made a big leap forward in technology and hasn't told anyone, but likes to go out and show it off all over the world? And the fourth one is, what's the chance that there would be aliens? And that's actually really high. I mean, there are aliens way out there, but what's the chance that they were out there and came here, but didn't do anything else to the universe we see? And so, like I said, I think that last chance is at least 1 in 1,000.
At least 1 in 1,000. But and that
at least 1 in 1,000.
To be clear, more charitable probably than many people would be, but also extraordinarily rare. And that's kind of where I wanted to go with this. I understand completely. We've spoken with Mick West on the show before. For instance, he is one of the more noted skeptics, and to some extent, he looks ridiculous at this point, trying to completely dismiss anything that we're seeing. But to give him credit, and this is what I said when we were talking about conversation with him, the 1 in 1,000 chance that you gave is to be clear, for most people particularly, that's a very small chance. That's not just 99%. That's 99.9% likely that it's not going to be that thing, which for many people would say basically you
we
were
consider
sure.
hypotheses though like that all the time,
yes.
right? I mean, most news articles, if you had asked the day before a news article, what's the chance this news article would appear in the paper the next day, you would assign a chance less than 1 in 1,000.
Exactly.
That's the nature of most news
articles. This happens all the time.
Right?
That's the nature of counterfactuals. And this is where I wanted to go with Bayesianism. I can understand why people would dismiss it, but at the same time, you have so much evidence supporting a couple of theories, but particularly that, so many people, we can just put it like this. The first two categories you included, that either it was a collective delusion or that it was a successful fabrication over decades, et cetera. Both of those seem increasingly unlikely, which really leaves us, I'm not, saying we should completely push those off the table, but that really leaves us the second two choices. And then you work your way down. I don't need to go through the thought process completely. My point was Bayesianism, this idea that we can both entertain how radical an idea is and try to look clearly at the evidence that would support its being true, seems crucial for this kind of thing. One last thing here, Elephant in the Brain. I've mentioned this book multiple times now. I want to give a chance to pitch it, and also because it relates completely. What's the topic of this book? What's it about? What do you and Kevin go over in this? And where can people find it?
Well,
Robin?
So we don't have much time, so I'll say that the subtitle of The Brain is Hidden Motives in Everyday Life. So the idea is that in a lot of big areas of life, including education, medicine, politics, religion, conversation, body language, you have a theory in your head about why you do those things, and that theory is mostly wrong. You do them for other reasons than you think, and those other reasons are not as flattering, and that's kind of why you aren't aware of them and would rather not see them.
Wait, we're going to push the break. We got to push the break.
Are you cool sticking with us for just a couple more minutes, Robin?
1,000% agree with you.
Thank you.
1,000% agree with you. And if I'm not mistaken, when I mentioned this once before, Shane disagreed with me. I made the point that people are motivated emotionally, and they come up with excuses to explain it. Part of the reason, I forget the name of the philosopher who came up with this. It'll come to me at some point. But even in studies, when you're looking at people's brains and you ask people questions, they will come up with an answer despite the fact that that answer is not true.
They'll rationalize it.
Yeah. It's like they call it the liar effect, where the person feels something and yet their brain is trying to describe it. And so their brain comes up with a reason for it. And it's very weird. It's very strange, but it's this kind of weird shadow behavior in the way that people do things. And the honesty of it is people have an emotional want that doesn't have to be right, fair, any of that stuff. They want it. And this aspect of themselves are pushing them ever so gently towards that direction to do it. Am I wrong? I mean, tell me if I'm wrong. That's where the name of the person will come to me. It'll come to me. I can't think of the name of it. But please, Robert, right, wrong, Robin, right, wrong, agree, disagree?
I completely agree. But I mean, the usual story is everybody's really good at finding hidden motives in other people, especially their rivals, that undermine what other people are saying. The hard thing is to see it in yourself. So to see it in yourself, I think you just need to look at lots of other people all at once and say, on average, what are other people doing when they're going to school or going to the doctor, et cetera? And then assume maybe that applies to you. But like I said, this plausibly applies to UFOs in the sense there's been this huge status dynamic in UFOs for over half a century, right? This isn't a neutral hypothesis to many people. This has been something that's been ridiculed in the most extreme way by the most standard authorities with vigor and disdain dripping off their lips, right? People have taken really strong stances on this.
Yes.
Not only the military authorities, but basically I'm a physics person and physicists are really, full of disdain for the whole idea that you would even consider something like this. It just seems to them completely, low status, basically. And a lot of people for a long time have really internalized this idea that this is the sort of thing that really lowbrow, really stupid people think about. And that smart people just know that you shouldn't ever consider anything like this at all seriously. And that's a really deep dynamic going on.
All of a sudden, the incentives changed, though. For some reason, it became a lot more prestigious simply because it was so unprestigious to talk about it before. Suddenly, it makes a lot more sense. Do you have any sense of how or why that happened? What is that actually? Because that, of course, itself is evidence. What does that lead you to believe, Robin? What's
by the way,
on there?
the name of the person, David Hume.
David Hume. That's what you're talking about. Yeah. Anyway.
So if you look at the four theories and we ask which of them might predict a big sudden change in opinion, the error theory doesn't really work, right? If people are just deluded on these things, then that hasn't changed. The hoax theory could work if all of a sudden, whoever is pushing this hoax wants to show us that the authority of the U.S. government is behind it because they want more people to believe the hoax. So that means the U.S. government kind of has to be behind the hoax. I don't know if that's true, but that at least would fit with the sudden backing of the theory by the U.S. government.
Yeah, those two first categories. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. The third category of some foreign power, that doesn't obviously predict a sudden change of heart, nor does the alien theory, unless, of course, they, finally see that the evidence is overwhelming and feel like they got to own up and admit, right?
Yeah.
That's the kind of scenario that would make they're changing their mind under those two theories.
I guess what's weird to me about the specific situation is that in every one of those circumstances and every one of the categories possibilities here, it involves a specific person or a group of people having to change their minds, which means that this whole revelation, this wave of videos that we're seeing, is intentional in some sense, not just the release, but the verification. And of course, the question is why. That's the constant looming thing here. Robin, at this point, we will go to our break. Another fascinating conversation. Love to have you back. Also, a tip or a tease or something like that. At some point, we should get into. I remember calling you as a producer for the show a couple of years ago. I think I just called your line over at George Mason University, and I got into prediction markets. This conversation about prediction markets and futarchy and using betting pools effectively over things happening in the future. An idea that you worked with DARPA on back in the day. I'm just giving that as something we should come back to if you're down at some point in the future to talk about, because it's a fascinating idea and it kind of fits in with everything that we've been talking about in terms of epistemology and, questioning your own beliefs. Regardless, though, Robin, great conversation this morning. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
Robin Hanson, for those listening, Associate Professor of Economics at George Mason University, also a futurist and an author. Fascinating conversation about aliens, the Fermi Paradox, the great filter idea, grab the aliens. Oh, grabthealiens.com. That's the website to check out if you want to read the paper, if you want to read supporting papers, essays, and more theories from Robin Hanson. Also, overcomingbias.com is Robin Hanson's personal website. Anyway, go check them out. You're listening to Fault Lines. We're coming back, taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. We'll be back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we're back and we're taking your calls. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and our phone lines are open, 202-521-1320. Nate, thank you for hanging out on the line. Nate from Virginia, you're on. What's on your mind?
Oh, hey. I'm actually from Atlanta, but I called just to make the two quick statements. One, your guest said the only way to be advanced further on in the future is through basically becoming a robot. In some sense, I think that's false. I mean,
well, wait, just to be fair, he's talking about like a million years.
Right. I think it's more so. There's a few different ways. One is that way. I think, in my personal belief, it's also that the ancient way is more spiritualism, like having a higher, getting more in touch with our spiritual side, as the ancients did.
What does that mean, Nate?
And so, like, there's a thing called the light body, in which, from all major religions, which you leave your physical body and become your original light body, and some of them go. The story is some of them go off into distant worlds and space and whatnot.
Well, what I'm getting at is what is that advancement from the standpoint of spiritual advancement? Like, for people who want to go into space and people who want to be robots. I don't want to be a robot. People who want to be robots or whatever. Why are those people wrong as opposed to the spirit? For example, how do people get the light body thing?
Right. So I don't think it's wrong with the robot thing. I mean, I'd rather not. But
I shouldn't have used the term wrong. I guess what I'm getting at is how do people get that spiritual evolution through that light body?
So
the robot is thing straightforward. The light body thing is a little more complicated.
Yeah, it's a lot more training. I mean, even with like psychic abilities and whatnot, all that different things. But in the one of the, not Sanskrit, but I can't
Pali?
right now. Gnosticism,
right.
But basically,
Wait, narcissism? What'd you say?
Gnosticism. I think it's in
Gnosticism.
Gnosticism.
Oh, Gnosticism,
Yeah.
like the Gnostics.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Gnostic text, but apparently through Jesus came back down in his light body, and he told his followers basically that the way to achieve your light body is.
Okay, hold up. I'm gonna tag it here. Nate from Atlanta, not Virginia. Sorry about the wrong something on the back end. Anyway, no, that is a possibility. I'm not gonna say spiritual development isn't possible, and I'm not even gonna say that the idea of a light body or whatever. I don't personally believe in that, but I'm not gonna say that's not true. Theoretically, however, it's compatible with becoming a robot. I think crucially,
is it?
I think so.
Well, you said the other day that you don't want to mangle the physical specimen where you have no ability to reach the spiritual self. You sound a lot like Nate yesterday.
I wasn't talking about a light body.
What were you talking about? You're talking about spiritual evolution.
And I think I was talking about the system. And I'm happy to talk about spiritual evolution.
I took it as you were talking about spiritual evolution and how that gets cut off because of this kind of technical.
If you're talking about yesterday when we were talking, because this would have been the most recent time that we would have had this kind of conversation. We were talking about like transgender participation in sports, and I was talking about the system and humanity, and now we're tied up. We've got two more callers.
Real quick, the light body thing. Look, you can do
roll
OBEs.
to disbelieve.
You can do an OBE.
Yeah.
And you will find that there is something there that you are in charge of as a vehicle that is weirder, that is not quite your regular body, but is a body nonetheless. Now, I don't know if that's what you're talking about.
So you say, I believe that you have had experience.
You can try it. I mean,
I hear you, and I haven't tried it diligently.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm just saying, I roll to disbelieve.
It's one of those things you have to experience, right? So for the standpoint of spiritual evolution, it's hard to kind of get people in that camp of like, dude, there's a there to. But
we've
go to the other
We've
callers.
got two more calls. These are like serious rabbit holes.
Yep.
Nate, I commend you for choosing a thing to call about that would itself completely derail if we let it this entire segment, because I would go deep into it. That's a good choice though. But Nate, thank you for the call. I appreciate it. We got Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Good morning, gentlemen. Pre-German science, free dinners are okay. The Armin lecture of the he might be the new chancellor of Germany. They had articles.
Armin Laschet, I believe is.
Yeah, that came out. Alexander Mercurus was explaining that he want to ease tensions with China and work more with China because they're already working with China. That's good, and they want to mend relations with Russia, which is a good thing. So it's like he's pushing back against the U.S. program. So he's going down the road of of peace because the trading portal. He's like they're gonna like work more and more with Eurasia, with Russia and China.
Yeah,
it's a good thing. So they're pushing it back against the U.S. program, and also, of course, Joe and Assad's family have to come to the United States to visit the Senate and the Congress. And that guy I was talking about, in a million, billion years, we don't know where we'll be at. We don't know what type of mindset the future will have. But at the same time, I know transhumanism is not like the be it all for humanity. We go beyond everything because it was the human beings that created the idea of transhumanism, and another human being that created the idea of something else that's better than that.
Maybe. Well, and because here's the weird thing about transhumanism to me, just as a concept, and we were talking, I believe Robin Hanson would identify as a transhumanist. Certainly he studies the idea of it. We're going to become something other than us, biological engineering, which we didn't really talk about there, or just the whole emulation thing, becoming cyborgs, all fit into under the transhumanism ideology, that whole thing. But isn't there something fairly, and this is kind of what you're getting, this is actually exactly what you're getting at, Tarif. Transhumanism is fundamentally humanistic in some sense. Since humanity's been around, we've always been trying to escape or at least redefine, modify our nature. What is culture if not changing the rules we're going to follow, how our biological, nurtured attitudes, reshaping it, changing who we are, changing what it means, which is what gives us the question and the ultimate uncertainty for a human being. What is it to be a person? What is it to be you? Who do you want to be? The agency, the idea that you have some choice over it, the idea that you can not just get piercings or whatever, but change the very fabric of your soul, change the structure of your identity intentionally. It's artificial. That fits with it. Anyway, Tarif, thank you for the call. We got one more caller. I'll be Malik. You're on. You got a couple seconds here. What's on your mind? Well, that was abrupt. That was the start of the hour. Malik, I don't know if we have time for you. We've got about... we don't have time for him. That was Andre, intentional. He said he's sorry. I was like, man, somebody really doesn't want Malik coming. It's not that late. It's not quite that late, but no. Anyway, Malik, I'm sorry we didn't get to you. Please call back tomorrow. Wasn't intentional on our part. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Thanks for listening to another edition of the show today. Thank you to all our callers, all our guests. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Jamarl Thomas, for co-hosting the show with me. Thank you, Engineer Andre. Thank you, producers Cordell and Austin. And thank you for listening. Have a great day, folks. See you again tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. Eastern.